Chapter 8. Olympicum pulverum collegis juvat. Horace. After the fight at Chantilly and division of the booty, the men who were with me, as usual, disappeared. Of the original 15 who had come with me from the army for temporary service, 5 or 6 had been captured one night at a dancing frolic. Beatty was not in this party when he was made a prisoner, but was captured in a fight. I gave notice of a meeting at Rector's X Roads in Loudoun County for the 31st of March. I had no idea until I got on the ground how many men I would have to go with me on my next raid, although I was confident that the success of my last one would attract a good many soldiers who were then at their homes on furlough. I was promptly there at the appointed time, and very soon 69 men mustered to go with me. This was the largest force I had ever commanded up to that time. The shaking up of a kaleidoscope does not produce more variegated colors than the number of strange faces that appeared among them. I had never seen more than a dozen of them before, and very few of them had ever seen each other. I remember that there were several of the Black Horse Company with them. The force, therefore, lacked the cohesion and esprit de corps which springs from discipline and the mutual confidence of men who have long been associated together. I had no subordinate officer to aid me in command. They were better dressed, but almost as motley a crowd as Falstaff's regiment. There were representatives of nearly all the cavalry regiments in the army, with a sprinkling of men from the infantry who had determined to try their luck on horseback. A good many of this latter class had been disabled for performing infantry duty by wounds. There were others who had been absent from their regiments without leave ever since the first battle of Bull Run. There were a number of the wounded men who carried their crutches along tied to their saddlebows. As soon as their commanders heard that I had reclaimed and converted them once more into good soldiers, they not only made requisition to have them return to their regiments, but actually complained to General Lee of their being with me. Now I took a practical and not a technical view of the question, and when a man volunteered to go into a fight with me, I did not consider it to be any more a duty of mine to investigate his military record than his pedigree. Although a revolutionary government, none was ever so much under the domination of red tape as the one at Richmond. The martinets who controlled it were a good deal like the hero of Molière's comedy, who complained that his antagonist had wounded him by thrusting in a quartet, when, according to the rule, it should have been in tierce. I cared nothing for the form of a thrust if it brought blood. I did not play with foils. The person selected to feed the army was a metaphysical dyspeptic who, it is said, lived on rice water and had a theory that soldiers could do the same. A man to fill such a position well should be in sympathy with hungry men, on the principle that he who drives fat oxen must himself be fat. When I received these complaints, which were sent through but did not emanate from headquarters, I notified the men that they were forbidden any longer to assist me in destroying the enemy. They would sorrowfully return to their homes. It was no part of my contract to spend my time in the ignoble duty of catching deserters. I left that to those whose taste was gratified in doing the work. Several of these men who had been very efficient with me were, on my application, transferred to me by the Secretary of War. I always had a Confederate fire in my rear as well as that of the public enemy in my front. I will add that I never appealed in vain for justice either to General R.E. Lee, General Stuart, or the Secretary of War, Mr. Seddon. And now, again, on the 31st of March, I set out once more to tempt fortune in the Fairfax forests. The men who followed me with so much zeal were not, perhaps, altogether of the saintly character, or excited by the pious aspirations of the Canterbury pilgrims who knelt at the shrine of Thomas à Becket. Patriotism, as well as love of adventure, impelled them. If they got rewards in the shape of horses and arms, these were devoted, like their lives, to the cause in which they were fighting. They were made no richer by what they got, except in the ability to serve their country. I did not hope for much on this expedition. The enemy had grown wary and were prepared for attack at every point. But I knew that if I dispersed the men without trying to do something, I would never see them again. The spring campaign was about to open, and most of them would soon be recalled to the army, and I would be left a major without a command. I concluded to attack the detached cavalry camp at Drainesville. In a letter to Stuart a few weeks before, I had suggested that the cavalry brigade then stationed at Culpeper Courthouse should do this. I said, "There are about 300 cavalry at Drainesville who are isolated from the rest of the command, so that nothing would be easier than to capture the whole force. I have harassed them so much that they do not keep their pickets over half a mile from camp." For some reason, Stuart did not undertake it. The reason was, I suppose, that he was saving his cavalry for the hard work they would have to do as soon as Hooker crossed the Rappahannock. The enterprise looked hazardous, but I calculated on being able to surprise the camp, and trusted a good deal to my usual good luck. Ames, Dick Moran, Major Hibbs, and John Underwood, who never failed to be on time, went with me. I thought I would vary my tactics a little this time, and attack about dusk. They would hardly look for me at vespers. Heretofore I had always appeared either in the daytime or late at night. I got to Herndon Station, where I had had the encounter 2 weeks before with the Vermont cavalry about sundown, and learned there that the camp at Drainesville, which was about 3 miles off, had been broken up on the day before, and the cavalry had been withdrawn beyond Difficult Run, several miles below. This stream has its proper name, as there are few places where it can be crossed, and I knew that these would be strongly guarded, so it was hopeless to attempt anything in that direction. As I was so near, I concluded to go on to Drainesville that night, in hopes that by chance I might pick up some game. After spending an hour or so there, we started up the Leesburg Pike to find a good place with forage for camping that night. I expected that our presence would be reported to the cavalry camps below, which would probably draw out a force which I could venture to meet. As all the forage had been consumed for several miles around, we had to march 5 or 6 miles to find any. About midnight we stopped at Miskell's farm, which is about a mile from the turnpike and just in the forks of Goose Creek and the Potomac. Although it was the last day of March, snow was still lying on the ground, and winter lingered on the banks of the Potomac. My authority over the men was of such a transitory nature that I disliked to order them to do anything but fight, hence I did not put out any pickets on the pike. The men had been marching all day and were cold and tired. The enemy's camps were about 15 miles below, and I did not think they could possibly hear of us before the next morning, when we would be ready for them. If they came after us, we fed and picketed our horses inside the barnyard, which was surrounded by a strong fence. Sentinels were stationed as a guard over the horses, and to arouse us in the event of alarm, many of the men went to bed in the hayloft, while others, including myself, lay down on the floor in the front room of the dwelling-house before a big log fire. With my head on my saddle as a pillow, I was soon in a deep sleep. We were within a few hundred yards of the river, and there were Union camps on the other side, but I had no fear of them that night. About sunrise the next morning I had just risen and put on my boots, when one of the men came in and said that the enemy on the hill over the river was making signals. I immediately went out into the backyard to look at them. I had hardly done so when I saw Dick Moran coming at full speed across the field, waving his hat and calling out, "The Yankees are coming!" He had stopped about 2 miles below, near the pike, and spent the night with a friend, and just as he woke up, about daylight, he had seen the column of Union cavalry going up the pike on our trail. By taking a short cut across the fields, he managed to get to us ahead of them. The barnyard was not 100 yards from the house, and we all rushed to it, but not more than 1/3 of our horses were then bridled and saddled. I had buckled on my arms as I came out of the house. By the time we got to the enclosure where our horses were, I saw the enemy coming through a gate just on the edge of a clump of woods about 200 yards off. The first thing I said to the men was that they must fight. The enemy was upon us so quick that I had no time to bridle or saddle my horse, as I was busy giving orders. I directed the men not to fire but to saddle and mount quickly. The Union cavalry were so sure of their prey that they shut the gates after passing through, in order to prevent any of us from escaping. As Captain Flint dashed forward at the head of his squadron, their sabers flashing in the rays of the morning sun, I felt like my final hour had come. Another squadron, after getting into the open field, was at the same time moving around to our rear. In every sense, things looked rather blue for us. We were in the angle of 2 impassable streams and surrounded by at least 4 times our number, with more than half of my men unprepared for a fight. But I did not despair. I had great faith in the efficacy of a charge, and in the affair at Chantilly had learned the superiority of the revolver over the saber. I was confident that we could at least cut our way through them. The Potomac resounded with the cheers of the troops on the northern bank, who were anxious spectators, but could not participate in the conflict. When I saw Captain Flint divide his command, I knew that my chances had improved at least 50%. When he got to within 50 yards of the gate of the barnyard, I opened the gate and advanced, pistol in hand, on foot to meet him, and at the same time called to the men that had already got mounted to follow me. They responded with one of those demoniac yells which those who once heard never forgot, and dashed forward to the conflict as reapers descend to the harvest of death. Just as I passed through the gate, at the head of the men, one of them, Harry Hatcher, the bravest of the brave, seeing me on foot, dismounted, and gave me his horse. Our assailants were confounded by the tactics adopted, and were now in turn as much surprised as we had been. They had thought that we would remain on the defensive, and were not prepared to receive an attack. I mounted Harry Hatcher's horse and led the charge. In a few seconds Harry was mounted on a captured one whose rider had been killed. When the enemy saw us coming to meet them, they halted and were lost. The powerful moral effect of our assuming the offensive, when nothing but surrender had been expected, seemed to bewilder them. Before they could recover from the shock of their surprise, Captain Flint, the leader, had fallen dead in their sight. Before the impetuous onset of my men, they now broke and fled. No time was given them to reform and rally. The remorseless revolver was doing its work of death in their ranks, while their swords were as harmless as the wooden sword of Harlequin. Unlike my adversaries, I was trammeled with no tradition that required me to use an obsolete weapon. The combat was short, sharp, and decisive. In the first moment of collision, they wheeled and made for the gate which they had already closed against themselves. The other squadron that had gone around us, when they saw their companions turn and fly, were panic-stricken and forgot what they had been sent to do. Their thoughts were now how to save themselves. Our capture was now out of the question. They now started pell-mell for the gate in order to reach it ahead of us. But by this time our men had all mounted, and like so many furies were riding and shooting among their scattered ranks. The gate was at last broken through by the pressure, but they became so packed and jammed in the narrow passage that they could only offer a feeble resistance, and at this point many fell under the deadly fire that was poured in from behind. Everywhere above the storm of battle could be heard the voices and seen the forms of the Dioscuri, Major Hibbs and Dick Moran, cheering on the men as they rode headlong in the fight. Dick Moran got into a hand-to-hand conflict in the woods with a party, and the issue was doubtful when Harry Hatcher came up and decided it. There was with me that day a young artillery officer, Samuel Chapman, who at the first call of his state to arms had quit the study of divinity and become, like Stonewall Jackson, a sort of military Calvin, singing the Psalms of David as he marched into battle. I must confess that his character as a soldier was more on the model of the Hebrew prophets than the evangelist or the Baptist in whom he was so devout a believer. Before he got to the gate, Sam had already exhausted every barrel of his 2 pistols and drawn his saber. As the fiery Covenanter rode on his predestined course, the enemy's ranks withered wherever he went. He was just in front of me. He was generally in front of everybody in a fight, at the gate. It was no fault of the Union cavalry that they did not get through faster than they did, but Sam seemed to think that it was, even at that supreme moment in my life, when I had just stood on the brink of ruin and had barely escaped, I could not restrain a propensity to laugh. Sam, to give more vigor to his blows, was standing straight up in his stirrups, dealing them right and left with all the theological fervor of Burleigh of Balfour. I doubt whether he prayed that day for the souls of those he sent over the Stygian River. I made him a captain for it. The chase was kept up for several miles down the pike. When the people at Drainesville saw Captain Flint pass through that morning in search of me, they expected to see him return soon with all of us prisoners. Among the first fugitives who had passed through and showed the day's disasters in his face was a citizen who had hurried down the night before to the camp of the Vermont cavalry to tell them where I was. Thinking that Captain Flint had an easy thing of it, he had ridden with him as a pilot to witness my humiliation and surrender. He escaped capture but never returned to his home during the war. I doubt whether his loyalty ever received any reward. He was also the first man to get back to the camp he had left that morning on Difficult Run, where he was about as welcome as the messenger who bore to Rome the tidings of Cannae. The Reverend Sam was not satisfied with the amount of execution he had done at the gate, but continued his slaughter until, getting separated in the woods from the other men, he dashed into a squad of the Vermont men who were doing their best to get away, and received a cut with a saber. But one of my men, Hunter, came to his rescue, and the matter in dispute was quickly settled. Down the pike the Vermont cavalry sped, with my men close at their heels. Lieutenant Woodbury had got 3 miles away when a shot from Ames laid him low. They never drew rein or looked back to see how many were behind them. I got pretty close to one, who, seeing that he was bound to be shot or caught, jumped off his horse and sat down on the roadside. As I passed him, he called out to me, "You have played us a nice April fool, boys." This reminded me that it was the first day of April. Some of the men kept up the pursuit beyond Drainesville, but I stopped there. The dead and wounded were strewn from where the fight began, at Miskel's, for several miles along the road. I had 1 man killed and 3 slightly wounded. I knew that as soon as the news reached the camps in Fairfax, a heavy force would be sent against me. So I started off immediately, carrying 83 prisoners and 95 horses, with all their equipments. At Drainesville were 2 sutlers' stores that had not been removed by their owners when the camps were broken up. These were, of course, appropriated and helped to swell the joy of the partisans. A more hilarious party never went to war or a wedding than my men were returning home. Danger always gives a keener relish for the joys of life. They struck up a favorite song of Tom Moore's, "The wine cup is sparkling before us," and the woods resounded with the melody. The dead and wounded were left on the field to be cared for by citizens until their friends could come after them. The number of prisoners I took exceeded the number of my men. One of my command, Frank Williams, had ridden early that morning to the house of a farmer to get his breakfast. The Vermont cavalry came up and got between him and us, and so Frank had to retreat. He, however, took 2 of them prisoners who had straggled off on the same errand and carried them along with him, as he had seen such an overwhelming force go down upon us, and as he knew that we were hemmed in by deep water on 2 sides. Frank took it for granted that my star had set forever. He started off to carry the news, and reached Middleburg that day, when he informed the citizen of what he supposed was our fate. There was, of course, loud lamentation over it, for many had a son or a brother or a lover there. Frank had been there an hour or so, anxiously waiting to hear something from us, but dreading the worst, when suddenly a blue column was seen coming up the pike. As blue was the predominant color, the first impression was that the men in gray were prisoners. But soon Dick Moran, who was riding in front, solved all doubts and fears as, with a voice louder than a Triton's shell, he proclaimed, "All right, Headquarters, Camp Fred's, April 4th, 1863. Mr. President, Major John S. Mosby reports that he was attacked early on the morning of the 2D 1st instant, near Drainesville, by about 200 Vermont cavalry. He promptly repulsed them, leaving on the field 25 killed and wounded, including 3 officers, and brought off 82 prisoners, with their horses, arms, and equipments. His force consisted of 65 men, and his loss was 4 wounded. The enemy has evacuated Drainesville." I had the pleasure to send by return courier to Major Mosby his commission of Major of Partisan Rangers, for which I am obliged to your Excellency. I am, with great respect, your obedient servant, R. E. Lee, Lieutenant General, His Excellency Jefferson Davis, President, Confederate States of America, Richmond, Va. Headquarters, Stahel's Cavalry Division, Fairfax Courthouse, Va. April 2nd, 1863. General, I have the honor to submit the following report, which is, however, made up from verbal information received from Colonel Price, Lieutenant Colonel Johnstone, and Major Taggart. I will forward the written report as soon as it is received, and shall take all possible means to ascertain the true state of the case. It appears that on the evening of the 31st ultimo, Major Taggart, at Union Church, 2 miles above Peach Grove, received information that Mosby, with about 65 men, was near Drainesville. He immediately dispatched Captain Flint, with 150 men of the 1st Vermont, to rout or capture Mosby and his force. Captain Flint followed the Leesburg and Alexandria road to the road which branches off to the right, just this side of Broad Run. Turning to the right, they followed up the Broad Run toward the Potomac, to a place marked J. Mezid Miskell. Here, at a house, they came on to Mosby, who was completely surprised and wholly unprepared for an attack from our forces. Had a proper disposition been made of our troops, Mosby could not by any possible means have escaped. It seems that around this house was a high board fence and a stone wall, between which and the road was also another fence and ordinary farm gate. Captain Flint took his men through the gate, and, at a distance from the house, fired a volley at Mosby and his men, who were assembled about the house, doing but slight damage to them. He then ordered a saber charge, which was also ineffectual, on account of the fence which intervened. Mosby waited until the men were checked by the fence, and then opened his fire upon them, killing and wounding several. The men here became panic-stricken, and fled precipitately toward this gate, through which to make their escape. The opening was small, and they got wedged together, and a fearful state of confusion followed, while Mosby's men followed them up and poured into the crowd a severe fire. Here, while endeavoring to rally his men, Captain Flint was killed, and Lieutenant Grout, of the same company, mortally wounded, will probably die today. Mosby's men followed in pursuit, and sabred several of our men on the road. Mosby, during his pursuit, is supposed to have received a saber wound across the face which unhorsed him. The rebels took some prisoners and a number of horses and fell back in great haste. In comparison to the number engaged, our loss was very heavy. As soon as Major Taggart received the report, he sent Major Hall in pursuit of Mosby, and to bring in our killed and wounded. Upon receiving the first intelligence, I immediately sent out Colonel Price with a detachment of the 6th and 7th Michigan and 1st Virginia Union cavalry, who searched in every direction, but no trace could be found of Mosby or his men, as information reached me too late. I regret to be obliged to inform the commanding general that the forces sent out by Major Taggart missed so good an opportunity of capturing this rebel guerrilla. It is only to be ascribed to the bad management on the part of the officers and the cowardice of the men. I have ordered Colonel Price to make a thorough investigation of this matter, and shall recommend those officers who are guilty to be stricken from the rolls. The list of killed and wounded will be forwarded as soon as received. I have the honor to remain your obedient servant, Jules Stahel, Major General S.P. Heinzelman, ta commanding, Ansi. Chapter 9. And thou, Dalhousie, thou great god of war, Lieutenant Colonel to the Earl of Mar. Waller. What in the newspaper slang of the day were termed the depredations of guerrillas, in the vicinity of Washington, induced the authorities there to make a change in outpost commanders. Wyndham, having played an unsuccessful game for over 2 months, during which time his headquarters had been raided and his coat and hat carried off by us in his absence, had given it up in despair and been sent to join his regiment at the front. The new person selected for the position was a major general in the army, and a whiskered pandour whose experience in foreign wars, it was hoped, would devise a remedy to suppress these annoyances. As soon as he took command, the cavalry camps in Fairfax resounded with the busy notes of preparation for a grand expedition, which he had resolved to undertake against us. It could no longer be endured that the war should be waged in full view of the dome of the Capitol, and the outposts could not stand the wear and tear of a perpetual skirmish, and the worry of lying awake all night waiting for an invisible foe to come and kill or capture them. The spring campaign was about to open, and if the hostile band that created this trouble could be exterminated, the cavalry division then doing duty in Fairfax might be thrown forward to the Rappahannock to aid Hooker's operations. The Major General was firmly persuaded, as no one had ever seen our camp, that the so-called guerrillas were nobody but the country farmers who collected together at night to make their incursions and dispersed by day to take care of their fields and flocks. The fights at Chantilly and Drainesville ought to have convinced him that the men who had routed his best regiments had some training in war and were no such irregular band as he imagined. It is true that, after I began operations in that region, many took up arms and joined me, who up to that time had followed peaceful pursuits. But whenever a citizen joined me and became a soldier, he discarded the habiliments of peace, put on his arms and uniform, and laid aside every other occupation. When the struggle was over, they relapsed into the habits of their former life, and like the Puritan soldiers of Cromwell, became as marked for devotion to their civil duties as they had ever been in war. As for myself, it was for a long time maintained that I was a pure myth, and my personal identity was as stoutly denied as that of Homer or the devil. All historic doubts about my own existence have, I believe, been settled, but the fables published by the Bohemians who followed the army made an impression that still lives in popular recollection. There is a lingering belief that my command was not a part of the regularly organized military force of the Southern Confederacy. The theory of the Major General, though contradicted by facts staring him in the face every day, got a lodgment in the minds of some people which has never been effaced. It was to confirm it that he now undertook to make a reconnaissance through the region infested by us. It happened that just at that time Hooker was preparing once more to cross the Rappahannock, and as a preliminary movement had sent Stoneman, with the cavalry corps up the river to seize the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and hold it as the line of communication with Washington. The line that connects an army with its base of supplies is the heel of Achilles, its most vital and vulnerable point. It is a great achievement in war to compel an enemy to make heavy detachments to guard it. It is equally as great a one to destroy the force that threatens it. It was to effect this latter object that in April 1863 the Major General set out on his expedition against me with 2 brigades of cavalry and a battery of artillery, which was to be the prelude of the opening of the campaign on the Rappahannock. Now it so happened that just about that time I received a letter from Stuart suggesting the capture of a train on the railroad. The effect of such a stroke, of course, would be to create uneasiness and alarm about the safety of Hooker's supplies. The following is an extract from Stuart's letter. There is now a splendid opportunity to strike the enemy in the rear of Warrenton Junction. The trains are running regularly to that point. Capture a train and interrupt the operation of the railroad, though it may be, by the time you get this, the opportunity may be gone. Stoneman's main body of cavalry is located near Warrenton Junction, Bealeton, and Warrenton Springs. Keep far enough away from a brigade camp to give you time to get off your plunder and prisoners. Information of the movements of large bodies is of the greatest importance to us just now. The marching or transportation of divisions will often indicate the plan of a campaign. Be sure to give dates and numbers and names as far as possible. I could offer no better proof than this letter of the useful services that may be rendered by an active partisan corps in cooperation with the movements of an army. It not only cripples an adversary, but communicates intelligence of his movements. Accordingly, I gave notice for a meeting at Upperville to undertake an enterprise against the railroad. I was willing to let the Union troops down in Fairfax rest while I turned my attention to Joe Hooker. On the evening of the day before the meeting, I had been with Beatty up to the mountain to get a fresh horse to ride on the raid, and we returned about dark. I met a citizen who informed me that a large Federal force was camped at Middleburg, and that there had been artillery firing there during the afternoon. I thought it was merely a false report that had gotten up a stampede, for I had not heard the firing, and I could not conceive what they could have been firing at, as we had no troops about there. I supposed that if they had come after me, they would have tried to keep it a secret and make as little noise as possible. About 9 o'clock that night, Beatty and I rode down in the direction of Middleburg to find out if there was any truth in the rumor. When we got on a high hill, about a mile off, that overlooks the town, we stopped to reconnoiter. The night was very cold, with a drizzling rain. Not a single campfire could be seen anywhere, and there was nothing to indicate the bivouacs of a military force. I said to Beatty, "This is just as I said, nothing but a stampede about nothing. If there were any troops about there, they would have campfires on such a cold night as this." We then rode forward, but had only gone a few hundred yards farther when we were halted and fired on by a picket. This, of course, proved that the rumor was true. We fell back. But it was a mystery I could not solve, why there should be an encampment of troops in such weather without fires. Then, too, there had been artillery firing. What could possibly have been the reason for that? The next morning I went, according to appointment, to meet my men at Upperville, having sent out some scouts toward Middleburg, which is 8 miles distant. My desire was to let the Union cavalry alone at Middleburg and strike the meditated blow at Hooker on the railroad. The force that had come up from Fairfax after me had now been practically eliminated from the campaign. I wanted, therefore, if possible, to slip away from them undiscovered. Early that morning the Major General put his column in motion on the pike for Upperville, but he had only gone a couple of miles before his advance guard was driven in by Tom Richards and a few men. This caused him to halt and get ready for action. On the day before, on his march up the turnpike, he had seen horsemen on the hills watching him, who, like the Arab when he folds his tent, had silently stolen away. On reaching Middleburg, the clouds seemed to thicken around him, for he had seen at least a dozen perched on the heights at different places gazing at him. They were evidently ready to light down on any stragglers and bear them off in their talons. The Major General unlimbered his guns and opened fire on every moving object in his sight. He did no damage to anybody, but his firing gave notice for miles around to people to get out of his way. There was a large grove near Middleburg, in which he proposed to bivouac that night. But before entering it, he shelled it so effectively as not only to expel any guerrillas that might be lurking there, but all animated nature. He carried along a newspaper correspondent to chronicle his exploits. His letter, published in the New York Tribune, shortly after that, made clear a number of things which I had not been able to understand before reading it. It praised his consummate skill and prudence in allowing no campfires during the night, as they would have lighted the way for the guerrillas to attack him, while the destructive artillery fire with which he had raked the forest showed that he possessed the foresight of a great general. It was also stated that he would only permit one half of his command to sleep at a time or unbridle and unsaddle their horses. With unconscious irony, the letter concluded by stating that the result of the expedition had demonstrated that Mosby hadn't over 25 men, who had been totally exterminated. After remaining in line of battle for some time, waiting for me to attack him, The Major General determined not to advance any farther toward Upperville, which lies just at the base of the Blue Ridge. It was surmised that the guerrillas, like the Cyclops, had taken refuge in caves on the mountainside, and there might be danger in approaching too closely, so he turned squarely off to his left. On his line of march he had swept the country of all the old men he could find, for he was firmly persuaded that in doing so he was breaking up my band. No plea in defense would be heard. A man named Hutchison, who was 70 years old, and had always used crutches, was among the prisoners. In vain he pleaded his age and infirmities as proof of the impossibility of his being a guerrilla. A Vermont soldier stepped forward and swore that he saw him leading the charge in the fight at Miskull's farm. He was sent to Washington as a trophy. The captives under guard marched in the rear of the column. About 80 men had met me at Upperville. In order to elude the Major General and execute my plan of capturing a train on the railroad, I made a detour by Salem, going on toward Thoroughfare Gap in the Bull Run Mountains. The Major General and myself, being ignorant of each other's plans, had also gone the same way. In order to avoid meeting the force that had driven in his advance from Upperville, somehow he had got the idea in his head that a large body of Stuart's cavalry was in the neighborhood, and he was not looking for them. An hour or so after I had passed through Salem, the Major General arrived there. He had started to return to Fairfax by making a circuit around through Thoroughfare Gap. Without any design on his part, he had struck right on my track. As I was marching very leisurely, for I did not want to get to the railroad until about dark, he might easily have overtaken me, but he did not seem to have the least desire to do so. He followed me at the rate of half a mile an hour. Having got all the old farmers prisoners, the measure of his ambition was full. He had at last destroyed the nest of vipers. He did not believe the body of cavalry that had gone on ahead were the very men he pretended to be looking for. Just as I reached Thoroughfare Gap, 2 of my men, Alfred Glasscock and Norman Smith, came galloping up and said that the enemy was pursuing me. They had, for some reason, remained behind at Salem and saw the Major General's command march through along the same road I was on. As he was only 1 hour behind me there, I felt certain that he was almost upon me. Some 4 miles back of where I was, the roads forked at a village called the Plains, one leading to Thoroughfare and the other to Hopewell Gap in the Bull Run Mountains. I immediately wheeled around and crossed over on the Hopewell Road and started back toward the Plains. I supposed the Major General was in pursuit of me, and as I could not undertake with less than 100 men to attack in front 4,000 cavalry and a battery of artillery, my intention was to try to cut off his rear guard before it passed the forks or the gap. But when I got on a high hill overlooking the plains, instead of meeting his rear guard when I rode forward to reconnoiter, I saw his advance that had just got to the forks. I halted, so did they, while their whole column rapidly deployed in line of battle, and the guns were placed in battery, ready for the expected onset. Every disposition was made by him to receive an attack. We stayed there facing each other over 1 hour, until it grew dark, when I disbanded my men. I had abandoned my enterprise against the railroad because I supposed that it had been discovered where I was going, and that if I went on, with the Major General behind me and Stoneman's cavalry in front, we would all be captured. He had learned at Salem that a body of cavalry had passed through just ahead of him, and at the Plains he saw that they had gone on the Thoroughfare Road. After giving us, as he supposed, ample time to get away, he started on the same route, when, with surprise, he saw a body of cavalry threatening him on the Hopewell Road. He had no idea they were the same cavalry whose track he was on. If he continued his line of march, he must go through one of the mountain passes, and remembering the fate of the Persians at Thermopylae, he determined now to halt. I took it for granted that he had stopped to go into camp at the Plains, but he, not knowing that I had disbanded my command and fearing a night attack, as soon as it became dark, began a retreat back toward Middleburg. Being a cautious general, he did not go along the main public road, but cut across fields and took private ways. The bridges across every stream he crossed were broken down after he passed, although some were so narrow that a man could jump over them, and trees were felled across the road to prevent us from charging his rear. After marching all night, he reached the vicinity of Middleburg about daybreak and went into camp. He had no idea that I had disbanded my men and gone off, but thought he had eluded us. Now, it had never entered my head that he was going to run away from me. Beatty and I had ridden on the same night over near Middleburg, and I stopped at the house of George McCarty. About daybreak he came running to where we were sleeping and called out to us, "Boys, get up quick. The Yankees are all around you." We jumped up, and 200 or 300 yards away we could see the field was blue with the Major General's command. We bridled and saddled our horses quickly and rode off unmolested in full view of them. The Major General and I had been running away from each other a whole day and night, and then came very near sleeping together. After taking a short rest from the fatigue of his night march, he started back to Fairfax with the battalion of graybeards he had taken prisoners, riding bareback with blind bridles on broken-down plow horses. They were marched down to Washington and paraded through the streets to gratify the curiosity of the people. They created a greater sensation than a circus. Such was the grand anticlimax to the Major General's Anabasis. It is so unique and complete in itself that I will not mar its epic unity by adding anything more to the narrative. Provost Marshal's Office, Fairfax Courthouse, VA, March 9, 1863, 3:30 a.m. Captain Mosby with his command entered this town this morning at 2 a.m. They captured my patrols, horses, and sea. They took Brigadier General Stoughton and horses, and all his men detached from his brigade. They took every horse that could be found, public and private, and the commanding officer of the post, Colonel Johnstone, of the 5th New York Cavalry, made his escape from them in a nude state by accident. They searched for me in every direction, but being on the Vienna road visiting outposts, I made my escape. L. L. Connor, Provost Marshal. P.S. All our available cavalry forces are in pursuit of them. Major Hunt, Untasked, AGHAT, General Heinzelmann's headquarters. General Stahel's report to War Dept. Says on the 13th day of March 1863, the day after General Stoughton was captured at Fairfax CH, I was on my way from Stafford Courthouse to New York on 8 days' leave of absence. Upon my arrival in Washington, I was summoned to report at once to President Lincoln. He told me of the capture of General Stoughton and the insecure condition of our lines in front of Washington. The President also said that he desired to have me in command in front of Washington to put a stop to these raids. He wrote a letter to General Heinzelmann, Com. DG, the Dept, of Washington, and directed me to go and see him on the same day, the 17th of March. I was appointed Major General of Volunteers. To take date from the 14th of March, 1863, General Stahel was relieved of his cavalry command on June 28, 1863. Heckers, Stahel's Cav, Div, Dept. Of Washington, Fairfax Courthouse, April 11, 1863. General, I have the honor to report with regard to the reconnaissance under command of Brig General J. F. Copeland, which left this place on the 3D day of April and returned here early, on the morning of the 6th instant, that it proceeded as far as Middleburg and searched diligently through that whole section of country without meeting any enemy in force or ascertaining definitely the whereabouts of Mosby. Small detachments of rebels, however, were occasionally seen, but scattered on the approach of our troops. On the 4th instant, early in the morning, in front of Middleburg, a collision occurred between one of his pickets and some of the enemy's, resulting in the death of one and the wounding of another on each side. During the expedition there were captured and arrested 61 prisoners, citizens and soldiers, 53 horses, 2 mules, a quantity of wheat, 3 wagons, saddles, bridles, guns, sabers, anks, all of which were turned over to the Provost Marshal of this place, and by him to Colonel Baker Washington, a copy of whose receipt is enclosed within Ants Jules Stahel to Major General S.P. Heinzelmann, Sa commanding, on ski. There is no report on file of Major General Stahel's expedition about 2 weeks after this in search of Mosby. Chapter 10. Our acts our angels are, or good or ill, our fatal shadows that walk by us still. If I had known at the time of the Major General's expedition to Fauquier all that I know now, I would not, of course, have abandoned the enterprise against the railroad. I had thought that after he struck my track at Salem he was really in pursuit of me, although he only followed at a terrapin's pace. I could not have anticipated that a Major General, starting out to win his spurs, would retreat as soon as he got in sight of the object he was in search of. I had disbanded my men, with instructions to meet me again in a few days at a certain place. I wanted to give the Major General time to get home, while I could recruit my forces, pick my flint, and try again. As the troops that belonged to the defenses of Washington were now on the defensive, it was my policy to let them alone, and turn my attention to Hooker's army, which was then preparing to cross the Rappahannock. I could most efficiently aid General Lee by assailing Hooker in the rear. A partisan commander who acts in cooperation with an army should always, if possible, operate against troops engaged in offensive movements. The Major General was now resting on his laurels. For 2 months preceding his raid into Fauquier, there had been incessant attacks on the outposts and daily alarm through the camps. All this had now suddenly ceased, and the quiet that reigned was supposed to confirm the truth of the report of the annihilation of my band. On May 2nd, 70 or 80 men assembled at my call. I had information that Stoneman's cavalry had left Warrenton and gone south, which indicated that the campaign had opened. My plan now was to strike Hooker. The moral effect of a blow from behind might have an important influence on the result. I started for Warrenton and reached there about dusk and learned that Stoneman was over the river. It was not known whether or not the Orange and Alexandria Railroad was still held by the Union troops. I went into camp near the town that night and started by daylight the next morning on the road leading to Fredericksburg, which crosses the railroad. I was sure that Hooker would not repeat the blunder of Burnside, but would cross at some of the upper fords of the Rappahannock. It was toward one of these that my course was directed. The roar of the guns at Chancellorsville could be distinctly heard, and we knew that the two armies were once more in the deadly embrace of battle. It was not more than 15 or 20 miles off, and we could easily reach there early in the day. I wanted to contribute my mite of support to the Southern cause. When we were within a couple of miles of the railroad, a bugle was heard, and I turned aside and marched to the sound. I thought it must come from a cavalry camp, which we might sweep through as we went along. Before we had gone very far, an infantry soldier was caught, who informed me that I was marching right into the camp of an infantry brigade. I found out that there was some cavalry on the railroad at another point, and so I made for that. These troops had just been sent up to replace Stoneman's. I committed a great error in allowing myself to be diverted by their presence from the purpose of my expedition. They were perfectly harmless where they were and could not help Hooker in the great battle then raging. I should, at least, have endeavored to avoid a fight by marching around them. If I had succeeded in destroying them all, it would hardly have been the equivalent of the damage I might have done to Hooker by appearing at United States Ford during the agony of the fight. There all of his wagons were packed. It would be difficult to calculate the demoralizing effect of the news on his army that the enemy was in their rear, and their trains and rations were burning up. Just as we debouched from the woods in sight of Warrenton Junction, I saw, about 300 yards in front of us, a body of cavalry in the open field. It was a bright, warm morning, and the men were lounging on the grass, while their horses, with nothing but their halters on, had been turned loose to graze on the young clover. They were enjoying the music of the great battle and had no dream that danger was near. Not a single patrol or picket had been put out. At first they mistook us for their own men and had no suspicion as to who we were until I ordered a charge and the men raised a yell. The shouting and firing stampeded the horses, and they scattered over a field of several hundred acres, while their riders took shelter in some houses nearby. We very soon got all out of 2 houses, but the main body took refuge in a large frame building just by the railroad. I did not take time to dismount my men, but ordered a charge on the house. I did not want to give them time to recover from their panic. I came up just in front of 2 windows by the chimney, from which a hot fire was poured that brought down several men by my side, but I paid them back with interest when I got to the window, into which I emptied 2 Colt's revolvers. The house was as densely packed as a sardine box, and it was almost impossible to fire into it without hitting somebody. The doors had been shut from the inside, but the Reverend Sam Chapman dismounted and burst through, followed by John DeButts, Mountjoy, and Harry Sweeting. The soldiers in the lower rooms immediately surrendered, but those above held out. There was a haystack nearby, and I ordered some of the hay to be brought into the house and fire to be set to it. Not being willing to be burned alive as martyrs to the Union, the men above now held out a white flag from a window. The house was densely filled with smoke and the floor covered with the blood of the wounded. The commanding officer, Major Steele, had received a mortal wound, and there were many others in the same condition. All who were able now came out of the house. After a severe fight, I had taken 3 times my own number prisoners, together with all their horses, arms, and equipments. Most of my men then dispersed over the field in pursuit of the frightened horses, which had run away. I was sitting on my horse near the house, giving directions for getting ready to leave with the prisoners and spoil, when one of my men, named Wild, who had chased a horse some distance down the railroad, came at full speed and reported a heavy column of cavalry coming up. I turned to one of my men, Alfred Glasscock, and said to him, "Now we will whip them." I had hardly spoken the words when I saw a large body of Union cavalry, not over 200 or 300 yards off, rapidly advancing. As I have stated, most of my command had scattered over the field, and the enemy was so close there was no time to rally and reform before they got upon us. In attempting to do so, I remained on the ground until they were within 50 yards of me, and was nearly captured. So there was nothing to do but for every man to take care of himself. I have already described the kind of command I had at this time. They were a mere aggregation of men casually gathered, belonging to many different regiments who happened to be in the country. Of course, such a body has none of the cohesion and discipline that springs from organization, no matter how brave the men may be individually. Men never fought better than they did at the house, while the defenders were inspired to greater resistance, knowing that relief was near. We had defeated and captured 3 times our own number, and now had to give up the fruits of victory, and in turn to fly to prevent capture. My men fled in every direction, taking off about 50 horses and a number of prisoners. Only one of my men, Templeman, was killed, but I lost about 20 captured, nearly all of whom were wounded. Dick Moran was among them. I never made a better fight than this, although finally compelled to retreat before 10 times my own number. 2, I had no subordinate officer to help me in command. As to its ulterior effects, it was about the same, as I shall hereafter show, as if I had not lost what I had won. The cavalry I had met was De Forest's brigade, that had come up the night before. As I have said, it was a mistake my making this fight, even if I had been completely successful. In all probability, it saved Hooker's transportation, just as the fight of the Prussians at the Bridge of the Dial saved Wellington, although they were beaten. It detained Grouchy long enough to keep him from Waterloo. I learned wisdom from experience, and after that always looked before I took a leap. When I ordered the charge at Warrenton Junction, I had no idea whether I was attacking 100 or 1,000 men. Just 1 year after that, I started with the purpose of attacking the rear of the Army of the Potomac, at the same place where I had intended to strike Hooker. I found the railroad guarded, but I crossed it unnoticed in the dark and went on. Lee and Grant had met in the wilderness. Grant had all of his transportation south of the river, with cavalry pickets at the United States ford. There was no chance to get at it. Hooker had left his on the north bank, where I was. I got one of Grant's trains near Aquia Creek, on the lower Potomac, but when I returned, a few days after that, to get another, found that he had detached a cavalry force to protect that route. This was what I wanted to make him do. It was that number of men subtracted from his strength. After striking one blow at the line of supply of an army, a demonstration will generally answer all the purposes of an attack. Hooker did not stay in the wilderness long enough for me to renew my attempt to get at his trains. When, after my rout, I appeared at Warrenton, attended by a single companion, where I had passed the night before with my command, I was apparently as forlorn as Charles, after dread Pultowa's day when fortune left the Royal Swede, but I felt no discouragement. My faith in my ability to create a command and continue my warfare on the border was still as unwavering as Francis Xavier's when he left the Tagus. To plant the cross on the shores of Coromandel, the enemy held the railroads as far south as the Rappahannock, and in a few days I got together 30 or 40 men and started down again to strike them somewhere. I found the bridges over Broad Run and Kettle Run unguarded. We set fire to them and left them in a blaze. It had not been expected that we would come back so soon, hence their want of precaution to provide for their safety. While the bridges were burning, the soldiers who had been put there to protect them were dozing in their tents not a mile off. In a few days I again went as far as Dumfries, but could find no assailable point. The trains all carried strong infantry guards, in addition to those stationed along the railroad. I started back without having effected anything, and stopped at the house of a man named Lynn to rest and feed our horses. As we were far inside the enemy's lines, there was some risk in this, but we were tired and hungry. Our horses had been unbitted and were eating their corn, and I was lying on the grass asleep when I was aroused by the cry that the enemy was coming. We barely had time to bridle up and mount before they were upon us. They came full speed on our trail and were strung out for a long distance on the road. This was my opportunity. A lieutenant was gallantly leading them. I saved myself this time by the same counterstroke that a few weeks before had rescued me from the brink of ruin in the fight at Miskel's farm. We did not wait for the danger, but went to meet it. There was a gate across the road, between us and the enemy, which I ordered to be opened. We dashed through, and in the moment of collision the lieutenant fell, severely wounded. Several others in the front met the same fate. They had drawn sabers that hurt nobody, and we used pistols. Their companions halted, hesitated, and were overpowered before support could come up. Some turned and fled, and in doing so communicated their panic to those in their rear. They fled pell-mell back toward their camp, leaving their dead and wounded on the field and a number of prisoners and horses in our hands. I then had, in turn, to get away quickly. I knew they would soon return with reinforcements. They did come, but we were gone. In returning, we crossed the railroad within a mile of Manassas, and in full view of the troops there, but were not molested. I found out from this raid the difficulty of making any impression with my small command on the force guarding the road. I could keep them on the watch, and in a state of anxiety and alarm, but while this might satisfy Stuart and General Lee, the men on whom I had to depend to do the work would not be content with such results. In order to retain them, it was necessary for me to stimulate their enthusiasm with something more tangible. War to them was not an abstraction. It meant prisoners, arms, horses, and sutler's stores. Remote consequences were not much considered. So I sent Beatty with a letter to explain the situation to Stuart, in which I said, "If you will let me have a mountain howitzer, I think I could use it with great effect, especially on the railroad trains. I have several experienced artillerists with me. The effect of such annoyance is to force the enemy to make heavy details to guard their communications. I have not attacked any of their railroad trains because I have no ammunition for my carbines, and they are pretty strongly guarded with infantry." In this letter I suggested the theory on which my warfare was conducted. It would not only draw troops from the front, but prevent those doing duty on the railroad and around Washington from being sent to Hooker to make up his losses in the wilderness. These operations were erratic simply in not being in accordance with the fixed rules taught by the academies, but in all that I did there was a unity of purpose, and a plan which my commanding general understood and approved. The Confederate drill sergeants could see no use in what they could not comprehend. In reference to the fight at Warrenton Junction, General Abercrombie reports, "Between the hours of 9 and 10 a.m., on the morning of the 3D ult, an outpost of the One-Stone Union cavalry at Warrenton Junction, about 100 men, under Lt. Colonel Krepp's command, were surprised and attacked by Major Mosby, with his force of about 125-75 men. The men of the One-Stone VA were scattered about the station, their horses unsaddled, in order to be groomed and fed. Mosby's force came in upon them from the direction of Warrenton, which place they left at daylight. Their front rank was dressed in the uniform of the United States. We were all dressed in gray, JSM, and they were supposed to be a force of Union cavalry until within a short distance, when they charged, and surrounded the house in and about which the 1st VA lay. After a short fight, in which several of the rebels were killed and wounded, the men of the One-Stone for the most part surrendered, and about 40 were being taken towards Warrenton by their captors, when a detachment of 70 men of the 5th NY cavalry, which was camped nearby under command of Major Hammond, came up, charged upon the rebels, and a running fight ensued, which was continued for 5 miles, in the course of which all the prisoners taken by Mosby were recaptured, with the exception of 2. Major General Stahel reports, "Our men being surprised and completely surrounded, rallied in a house close at hand, and where a sharp fight ensued. Our men defended themselves as long as their ammunition lasted, notwithstanding the rebels built a large fire about the house, of hay and straw and brushwood. The flames reached the house, and their ammunition being entirely expended, they were obliged to surrender. Major Steele of the 1st VA was mortally wounded in the house. Chapter She, Quis jam fluctus, quae regio in terris non nostri plena laboris. Aeneid. At this time General Lee was making the preliminary movement of the Gettysburg campaign up the left bank of the Rappahannock, while Hooker moved on a parallel line on the other. Pleasanton's cavalry corps was massed on the river near Rappahannock Station, about 50 miles from Washington, which was now covered by Hooker's army in compliance with my request. Stuart sent me a small mountain howitzer by Beatty. A brigade of cavalry and one of infantry were lying between Manassas and Catlett Station, and here was the only possible chance of reaching the railroad without being discovered, On May 29, 1863, I set out with about 40 men and my little gun to strike it somewhere between these points. I had no caisson, but carried 15 rounds of ammunition in the limber chest. The enterprise on which I was going, when judged by the common standards of prudence, appeared not only hazardous but foolhardy. The camps of the enemy were distributed along the road at intervals of 1 or 2 miles, with patrols continually passing. Every train had on board a strong infantry guard. If I should succeed in penetrating their lines and making a capture, it could not be done without alarming the camps, which would make my retreat difficult, if not impossible. But I thought the end justified the risk. An attack even by my small band at such a critical time might create an important diversion in favor of General Lee. If this could be done, then the loss of the gun and even of my whole command would be as dust in the balance against the advantage of it. We bivouacked that night in the pines near Catlett's, and were awakened in the morning by the revel in the Union camps, which were a mile or so distant on either side of us. There was a narrow pathway through the pines, along which we marched until within 100 yards of the railroad. The telegraph wire was cut, and a rail sufficiently removed to allow a train to run off the track. The howitzer was in charge of the Reverend Sam Chapman, who had been so conspicuous in the fight at Miskel's. It was now made ready for action. All of us were under cover, with one man near the road to give notice of an approaching train. We had not waited long before he gave the signal. I rode forward and saw it puffing along. Chapman rammed down a charge in his gun, and all awaited the event with breathless interest. I was in fear every moment of a patrol coming on the road who might give the alarm and stop the train. Fortunately, none came. The engineer, not suspecting danger, was driving at full speed, when suddenly the locomotive glided from the track. The infantry guard fired a volley which did no injury to us except killing a horse. In an instant, a shell from Chapman's gun went crashing through the cars. They all jumped off and took to their heels through the pines. In the stampede, they did not take time to count our number. If they had stood their ground, they could have easily driven us away. Another shell was sent through the boiler of the engine. The infernal noise of the escaping steam increased the panic among the fugitives. There were several bales of hay on the train that were set on fire. The whole was soon in flames. One car was loaded with sutler's goods, which the men did not permit to be entirely consumed by the fire. There was also a number of fresh shad, and each man secured one of these. The blockade of the Potomac had for a long time deprived us of that luxury. The United States mailbags were tied to the carriage of the howitzer, and we started to retrace our steps. I have been criticized a good deal at the North for capturing trains on railroads used for military purposes. To justify myself, it is not necessary for me to use the tu quoque argument, and retort that my adversaries did the same whenever they could, for the plain reason that I was simply exercising a belligerent right. There was nobody but soldiers on this train, but if there had been women and children too, it would have been all the same to me. Those who travel on a road running through a military district must accept the risk of the accidents of war. It does not hurt people any more to be killed in a railroad wreck than having their heads knocked off by a cannon shot. One of the most effective ways of impeding the march of an army is by cutting off its supplies, and this is just as legitimate as to attack it in line of battle. Jomini says that the irregular warfare of the Cossacks did more to destroy the French army on the expedition to Moscow than the elite regiments of the Russian Guard. After the peace, all Europe hailed their hetman, Platov, as the hero of the war, and the Corporation of London gave him a sword. But to return to my story. I had penetrated the enemy's lines, and the difficulty was now to get out. The sound of the cannon had given the alarm. The long roll was beaten through all the infantry camps, and the bugles sounded to horse. As I had never used a piece of artillery before, it was not known that I had it. It was thought at first that Stuart had come in behind them, and hence they advanced on me cautiously. When I had got about a mile from the railroad, I met a regiment of New York cavalry, the 5th, in the road directly in front of me. It had come up from the camp below at Kettle Run to cut us off. We halted while Chapman unlimbered, and sent a shell at them, which fortunately burst at the head of the column and killed the horse of the commanding officer. This created a stampede, and they scattered before another shell could get to them. The way was now open, and we went on by the horse, lying with his accoutrements in the road. I made Foster and a few others gallop forward to produce the impression that we were pursuing, but soon recalled them to the gun, as I was expecting the enemy every moment in my rear. We were now girt with foes on every side, It would, of course, have been easy to save ourselves by scattering through the woods, but I was fighting on a point of honor. I wanted to save the howitzer, or if I had to lose it, I was determined to exact all that it was worth in blood. After we got about a mile further on, the regiment we had broken rallied, and with reinforcements came on again in pursuit. Another shell was thrown at them, and they fell back. We were just on the edge of a wood, and I ordered Chapman to go forward with his gun at a gallop, while I remained behind with 6 men as a rear guard to cover the retreat. Clouds of cavalry, which had been attracted by the firing, were now seen in different directions, and the enemy once more moved toward us. With less than 50 men, I was confronting De Forest's brigade of cavalry. At one time we had been entirely enveloped by them, but had broken through their line. As the enemy came near, we slowly withdrew. Their advance guard of 12 or 15 men suddenly dashed upon us as we were retiring through the woods. We wheeled and had a fierce hand-to-hand fight, in which they were routed and driven back. Several of their dead and wounded were left on the ground. I have before spoken of Captain Hoskins, an English officer who had recently joined me. He was riding by my side when the fight began. The tradition of chivalry inherited from the ancient knights of using the sword in single combat still asserted its dominion over him, but my other men had no more use for that antiquated weapon than a coat of mail. They had discarded it as a useless encumbrance. Hoskins was in the act of giving a thrust when he was shot. In an instant after, his adversary fell before a deadly revolver. Hoskins's wound was mortal. When the fight was over, he was taken to the house of an Englishman nearby, and lived a day or two. Thus died as gallant a gentleman as ever pricked his steed over Palestine's plains. He had passed without a scar through the fire of the Redan and the Malakoff to fall in a petty skirmish in the American forests. I could not stay by him, and I had no means of carrying him off. The overwhelming numbers pressing upon us forced a retreat, and we had to leave him by the roadside with his lifeblood ebbing fast away. The horse that I had presented to him disdained capture and followed us. I gave it to Beatty. He was buried in his martial cloak at Greenwich Church, and now, like Lara, sleeps not where his fathers sleep. Seeing that no hope was left us but to save our honor and stand by the gun, I sent Foster with an order to Chapman to halt and unlimber in a narrow lane on a hill. The high fences on both sides were some protection against a flank attack of cavalry. I knew we could hold the position as long as the ammunition lasted for the gun. Some of the men who had joined me, thinking that they were going on a picnic, had already left to fry their shad and eat the confectionaries they had got on the train. When I rode up to Chapman, he had his gun already shotted. Mountjoy and Beatty were standing by it. Their faces beamed with what the Romans called the gaudia certaminis, and they had never looked so happy in their lives. As for myself, realizing the desperate straits we were in, I wished I was somewhere else. Sam Chapman and his brother William, who afterward became the lieutenant colonel of my battalion, had commanded the battery which, under Longstreet's orders, had shattered Fitz-John Porter's corps in its assault on Jackson's line at Groveton Heights. When the Federal cavalry came in sight a couple of 100 yards off, he sent them a shell that exploded in their ranks, and they fell back in confusion to the woods. They reformed and came again. If they had deployed as foragers, we would have been driven away without inflicting much loss on them. But they committed the error of charging up the road in a solid column of fours, where every discharge from the gun raked them with grape and canister. They made several successive onsets of this kind, which Chapman repulsed. In turn, we would charge and drive them a considerable distance, and then return to the gun. This was repeated several times over ground strewn with their killed and wounded men and horses. The damage done here to my side was that Bill Elzey had several teeth knocked out by a bullet. They used their sabers, and we the revolver. At last the supreme moment came. Chapman had rammed home his last round of ammunition, and a heavy column was again advancing. I sat on my horse just behind the gun. When they got within 50 yards, it again belched with fire and knocked down a number of men and horses in their front. They halted, and at the same time I ordered a charge and drove them down to the foot of the hill. I was riding a spirited sorrel horse, who carried me with so much force that I could not hold him up until I had gone some distance through their ranks. Charlie McDonough followed me. As I passed by a big cavalryman, he struck me a blow with his saber on the shoulder that nearly knocked me from my seat. At the same instant my pistol flashed, and he reeled from his saddle. McDonough and I were now hemmed in by high fences on both sides. The Federal soldiers we had passed in the road, seeing that nearly all my men had left the gun, which had ceased firing, made a dash at it. Beatty managed to mount and get away. George Tuberville, who acted as driver, went off at full speed and saved his 2 horses and limber chest. Mountjoy, who was one of the bravest of the brave, was captured at the gun after he had fired his last cartridge. The Reverend Sam Chapman had passed through so many fights unscathed that the men had a superstition that he was as invulnerable as the son of Thetis. His hour had come at last, and a bullet pierced the celestial armor of the soldier priest, but he fought with the rammer of his gun as he fell. He lived to pay the debt he contracted that day. For time, at last, sets all things even. The victors now held the howitzer, and barred the only way for my escape, but I held in my hand a more potent talisman than Douglas threw into the Saracen ranks. My faith in the power of a 6-shooter was as strong as the Crusaders' was in the heart of the Bruce. I darted by the men who were now in possession of the gun, and received no hurt, except getting my face badly scratched by the limb of a tree as I passed. I had left Hoskins, Chapman, and Mountjoy in the hands of the enemy. Their shouts of triumph now rang through the woods, but no further pursuit was made. With a single companion, I stopped at a farmhouse, washed the blood from my face, and started back to get ready for another raid. In a week I had rallied, and was down in Fairfax stirring up the outposts. Stewart sent me a message that I might sell another gun for the same price. I had effected more than I had hoped. When the news of my route reached headquarters at Fairfax Courthouse, a flaming dispatch which is printed in Moore's Rebellion record was sent north, announcing that within 2 or 3 days Mosby had lost 150 men, and General Stahel will not let him rest until his band is exterminated. As I had all the time acted on the offensive, it was easy enough for me to get rest by keeping quiet, as I had never had 1/2 that number of men. Of course I could not have lost them. As long as I could keep 1,000 men watching on the defensive for every one that I had with me, it was a small matter who got the best in a fight. The Count of Paris, who was a staff officer in the Union Army, in his History of the War, mentions the 2 affairs. On the railroad, and says in Washington itself, General Heintzelman was in command, who beside the depots, the regiments under instruction, and the artillery in the forts, had under his control several thousand infantry ready to take the field, and Stahel's division of cavalry, numbering 6,000 horses, whose only task was to pursue Mosby and the few hundred partisans led by this daring chief. If Pleasanton had had those 6,000 sabres with him a few days after this, on June 9, 1863, in his great cavalry combat with Stewart at Brandy Station, the result might have been different. Hooker had asked for them, but had been refused on the ground that they could not be spared from the defense of Washington. 3. Headquarters, May 30th, 1863. Stahel to Heintzelman. We had a hard fight with Mosby this morning, who had artillery, the same which was used to destroy the train of cars. We whipped him like the devil and took his artillery. My forces are still pursuing him. A more full report will follow. Hoping the general will be satisfied with this result, Jules Stahel, Major General Stahel reports of the above affair that the train for Bealeton had just passed up, and believing it to have been attacked, he, Colonel Mann, immediately went with a detachment of the 5th N.Y. Cavalry, under command of Captain H. Hasbrouck, a detachment of the 1 Stone Vermont, under command of Lt. Colonel Preston, and a small detachment of the 7th Michigan. The detachment of the 5th New York was sent directly across the country in order to intercept the rebels, while the balance of the command went directly to the scene of action. The advance of the 5th New York, led by Lt. Elmer Barker, came up with the enemy first, and found them with the howitzer posted on a hill, with the cavalry drawn up in line in the rear to support it. Lt. Barker, with his small detachment of about 25 men, dashed up the hill, and when within about 50 yards of the gun, received a charge of grape and canister, which killed 3 and wounded 7 of our men and several horses. The enemy then charged upon us, but were met with a stubborn resistance by the lieutenant and his men. Although the lieutenant had received 2 grape shots in his thigh, we were, however, overpowered and driven back a short distance. Just then Colonel Preston of the 1st Vermont Lt. Hazelton, with companies H and C being in advance, came up at a full charge upon their flank, and were received with a discharge from the howitzer of grape and canister. Our men pressed on, however, until they came to a hand-to-hand conflict, when the enemy gradually fell back. We took their howitzer, and they fled in every direction. Our loss was 4 killed, 15 wounded. the names of which please find enclosed. We also lost 11 horses killed and several wounded. Chapter 12. Fight as thy fathers fought, fall as thy fathers fell. Thy task is taught, thy shroud is wrought, so forward and farewell, prayed. I now turned my attention once more to the troops guarding the line of the Potomac and the defenses of Washington. I was afraid that if I continued my attacks on the railroad and in the vicinity of Hooker's camps, the cavalry division of Stahel would be released from doing guard duty and sent to the front on the Rappahannock. 4. So on June 3rd, only 3 days after I had been routed and my howitzer captured near Greenwich, I collected 30 or 40 men and started once more for Fairfax. The cavalry down there had enjoyed a season of rest for several weeks. We passed by Frying Pan at night and slept in a thicket of pines on the Ox Road. John Underwood was sent forward with a squad of men to fire on the pickets or patrols. I knew that this would draw out a force in search of us the next morning. Just as I had gotten a doze, I heard several shots. The men burst out laughing and said, "That's John Underwood." I had directed him to remain concealed by the roadside to watch for any scouting party of the enemy that might come out in the morning. About sunrise, I received a message from him that a body of about 50 cavalry had gone up the road. In an instant we were all in our saddles, but just then Underwood galloped up and informed me that another body had passed on. 4. In his testimony before the Committee on the Conduct of the War, General Hooker says, Vol. I, page 162. I may here state that while at Fairfax Court House my cavalry was reinforced by that of Major General Stahel, the latter numbered 6,100 sabres, and had been engaged in picketing a line from Occoquan River to Goose Creek. This line was concentric to, and a portion of it within, the line held by my army. The force opposed to them was Mosby's guerrillas, numbering about 200, not over 30 men, and, if the reports of the newspapers were to be believed, this whole party was killed 2 or 3 times during the winter. From the time I took command of the Army of the Potomac, there was no evidence that any force of the enemy, other than that above named, was within 100 miles of Washington City, and yet the planks on the chain bridge were taken up at night during the greater part of the winter and spring. It was this cavalry force, it will be remembered, I had occasion to ask for, that my cavalry might be strengthened when it was numerically too weak to cope with the superior numbers of the enemy. How many do you think there are? About 100, was his answer. All the better, I said. We are in their rear. It is just as easy to whip 100 as 50. Forward, trot! The party of the first part got to Frying Pan and halted. We overtook the second party just as we got in sight of the first. They were utterly confounded at seeing a lot of men coming up on their rear shooting and shouting. They hadn't time to wheel around to meet an attack from behind, but broke and ran away. They were driven pell-mell in a cloud of dust upon the body of cavalry that had halted at Frying Pan, and in turn they communicated the panic to their friends. I came very near being caught here in the same trap that I got in at Warrenton Junction, but managed to get out without loss, beside carrying off a number of prisoners and horses. Some of my men had chased the fugitives a few hundred yards when they unexpectedly came on a regiment of Federal cavalry drawn up in line just over a hill. I have since ascertained that it was Colonel Gray of the 6th Michigan Cavalry. He had come out on another road and, hearing the firing at Frying Pan, had formed to receive an attack. If he had followed the example of Major Hammond with the 5th New York at Warrenton Junction and charged us when we were in disorder and scattered over the field, that would in all probability have been my last day as a partisan commander. As soon as I heard of this third body of cavalry, which I had not seen, I drew off my men as rapidly as possible, while Colonel Gray was waiting to receive us. He managed to catch Dr. Alexander, who was with me. I went off home with my spoil, and it was announced in Washington that I had once more been routed and driven away. A few days after that I caught a Federal surgeon and set him free on the condition that he would try to secure the release of Alexander. He kept his pledge. As I have before stated, I had 2 months before this time received authority from the War Department, through General Lee, to raise a command. A good many men had joined me, but a considerable number of them had been captured at different times by raiding parties of the enemy. As it was the 3rd year of the war, the soldier element in the country had been pretty well exhausted by conscription, and I was forbidden to receive recruits from this class subject to conscript duty. It was therefore very difficult for me to get 60 eligible men, which was the legal standard for organizing a company. By this time I had about that number on my muster roll, but at least a third of them were in prison, having been captured at various times by raiding parties of the enemy. On June 10, 1863, my first company was organized at Rector Crossroads, with James W. Foster as captain, Thomas Turner of Maryland as first, William L. Hunter, now of California, as 2D, and George Weitzcomer as 3D lieutenant. In compliance with law, I had to go through the form of an election, but I really appointed the officers and told the men to vote for them. This was my rule as long as I had a command, and with 2 or 3 exceptions, their conduct vindicated my judgment. On the same day that the company was organized, I started for the Potomac, as it was my policy to keep up a state of alarm about the capital. I had long meditated crossing the river, but it was not fordable during the spring and winter season. This was but a few weeks after the Battle of Chancellorsville, and there was great fear at the north of a Confederate invasion. General Lee V was then moving up the Rappahannock on his way to Pennsylvania. I knew that if I only crossed over once, a small army would be detached to protect the border. Information had reached me that a squadron of Michigan cavalry was at Seneca, and I resolved to attack it. My plan was to cross the river at night, capture the patrols, and surprise the camp about daybreak. 6. Unfortunately, the night was very dark. My guide missed the way, and we did not get over the river until daybreak. I sent Alfred Glasscock, Joe Nelson, and Trunnell ahead, who concealed themselves in the bushes on the canal bank and seized the patrol as it came along without giving any alarm. When I reached the northern bank, they were waiting for me. The same party then went on up the towpath and captured a canal boat and some mules, while I halted a short time to close up the command. When we got near the bridge over the canal, we met another patrol that fired and fled. They pulled up the drawbridge behind them, and it took us some minutes to replace it. This delay gave time to the cavalry in camp to saddle up. Before we got in 200 yards of them, they retreated rapidly. After crossing a narrow bridge over Seneca Creek, they halted and held it against a few of my men who had pursued them. They were armed with carbines and poured such a hot fire into the men that they started to fall back. Just then I rode up. Some of them were carrying Glasscock away, as he had been severely wounded. 5. The following correspondence between General Pleasanton, Chief of Cavalry, and General Ingalls, Chief Quartermaster of the Army of the Potomac, which I recently found in the archives of the War Department, shows the anxiety at that time to suppress my command. I had never heard of it before I saw it there. It is evident that somebody had hoaxed General Pleasanton, as the whole negotiation was confined to himself and General Ingalls. The fact that he had an unlimited amount of money placed at his disposal for buying me, and did not do it, is conclusive proof that there never had been a chance for it. Headquarters Cavalry Corps, June 12, 1863. General R. Ingalls, Tay Chief Quartermaster, dispatch received. Ask the General how much of a bribe he can stand to get Mosby's services. There is a chance for him, and just now he could do valuable service in the way of information, as well as humbugging the enemy. There's no news. The rebels are like the boy the President tells about who stumped his toe and was too big to cry. Birney is up, a Pleasanton and Brigadier General. Headquarters, Army of the Potomac, June 12, 1863. General Pleasanton, if you think your scheme can succeed in regard to Mosby, do not hesitate as to the matter of money. Use your own judgment, and do precisely what you think best for the public interest. Robert Ingalls, Brigadier General. 6 Middleburg, Va., June 10, 1863. General, I left our point of rendezvous yesterday for the purpose of making a night attack on 2 cavalry companies of the enemy on the Maryland shore. Had I succeeded in crossing the river at night as I expected, I would have had no difficulty in capturing them, but unfortunately, my guide mistook the road, and instead of crossing by 11 o'clock at night, I did not get over until after daylight. The enemy, between 80 and 100 strong, being apprised of my movement, were formed to receive me. A charge was ordered, the shock of which the enemy could not resist, and they were driven several miles in confusion. With the loss of 7 killed, a considerable number wounded, and 17 prisoners, also 20-odd horses or more, we burned their tents, stores, camp equipage, etc. I regret the loss of 2 brave officers killed, Captain Bronner and Lute. George H. Whitescarver. I also had one man wounded. Respectfully, your obedient servant, John S. Mosby, a major of Partisan Rangers. Major. General J. E. B. Stewart, Headquarters Cavalry Division, June 16, 1863. Respectfully forwarded. In consideration of his brilliant services, I hope the President will promote Major Mosby, J. E. B. Stewart, Major General. After waiting a minute or two for my command to close up, we dashed across the bridge and completely routed the cavalry on the other bank. Frank Stringfellow rode by my side as I led the charge, but we had hardly got over before George Whitescarver was ahead of us. The Michigan men broke and fled, leaving behind 17 prisoners, 30 horses, their colors, 4 dead and 1 wounded, beside all their camp equipage and stores. They had formed a line of a crescent shape not more than 50 yards from the bridge, on which they poured a converging fire, but not one of us was touched in going over. I had not gone 100 yards in pursuit when Foster, who was riding by me, said, "As we passed a dead man in the road, there is one of our boys." He was so begrimed with dust that I did not recognize him. It was Whitescarver. The men were soon recalled. I was apprehensive that the enemy's cavalry on the river above might come down the towpath and intercept us. Then there was the danger, if I tarried too long in Maryland, that Major General Stahel would be ready to catch me on the Virginia shore, for his camps were only a few miles below. I was accompanied that day by Captain Brawner, who commanded an independent company, and had come over to Fauquier a few days before. With 2 or 3 men he had kept on after I had abandoned the pursuit, and was killed. 7. I returned to Middleburg unmolested, wrote a despatch to Stewart, and forwarded my prisoners. The next day I sent him the captured guidon by Major White of his staff. The raid had all the effect I desired in arousing the fears of the enemy for the safety of the North. 7. One who was in command at Poolesville, M.D. A few miles from Seneca, reports about 250 of the enemy's cavalry crossed the Potomac near Muddy Branch at daybreak. The enemy dashed rapidly up the canal, driving in the patrols, and attacked Captain Dean's company, I-6th Michigan Cavalry, on duty at Seneca Locks. Captain Dean fell back toward Poolesville, forming line 3 times, and only retreating when nearly surrounded. The enemy followed to within 3 miles of Poolesville, when he rapidly retired, destroying the camp of Captain Dean, and recrossing the river at the point where he had crossed. Our losses: 4 men killed, 16 men missing, 1 man wounded. Colonel Thompson of the California Cavalry Battalion, who accompanied Colonel Lowell in pursuit of me through Leesburg, recently informed me that when they got to Fairfax on their return, they found General Stahel's division prepared for battle. Stahel had sent out scouting parties over the country. I had no positive knowledge of the intention of General Lee to invade the North, but all signs pointed that way. First came the news of Milroy's rout by Ewell at Winchester. As I was looking for Stewart every day, I made no more raids that week, but held my men ready to do any work that he wanted. On June 16, Stewart crossed the Rappahannock and bivouacked near Piedmont Station in Fauquier that night. On the same day, I went with a few men on a scout in the neighborhood of Thoroughfare to find out which way Hooker was moving. I saw from the smoke of his campfires that he was retiring on Washington as Lee advanced toward the Potomac. Early on the morning of the 17th, I visited Stewart's headquarters at Miss Kitty Shacklett's house. As he was mounted on a very indifferent horse, I gave him a fine sorrel that one of my men had recently captured from a Michigan lieutenant. I told him what I knew about the position of the enemy, and that I was ready to perform any service he wanted. The cavalry moved on to Middleburg, and I met him there again in the afternoon. There were 30 or 40 of my men with me. He had never seen them before, and made some jocular remarks about them as they passed. We had a short conference, and he approved of the expedition on which I was going across the Potomac. There had been so many alarms along the enemy's lines that it was difficult for them to reinforce any one point more strongly than it had been, and I knew that they would now rely on the presence of Hooker's troops for the protection of Maryland. I did not think they were expecting me to come back to Seneca. My idea was to create a diversion in favor of General Lee, who was marching into the Shenandoah Valley, and also to keep him informed of the movement of the enemy. I bade Stewart goodbye, and told him that he would soon hear from me. He had sent Wickham's brigade down to picket the gap in the Bull Run Mountain at Aldie. His duty was to observe the enemy and mask the movements of the Confederate army. My command turned off 3 miles above there and moved again toward Seneca. It was a very hot day, and we had stopped a while to rest under the shade of some trees, and refresh ourselves with buttermilk at the house of a farmer named Gulick. Presently we heard artillery firing over toward Aldi, which indicated a collision of the enemy's cavalry with ours. In an instant every man was mounted. From a commanding position on the mountain, which we reached in a few minutes, I could see clouds of dust rising on every road, which showed that Hooker was marching for the Potomac. After going a little farther, we captured a number of prisoners, and I immediately sent a dispatch to Stuart with the information I got from them. I could not now get to Seneca without passing through Hooker's infantry, so I concluded to go down on the Little River Turnpike and operate on the line of communication between Pleasanton's cavalry and the general headquarters. I knew I could gather some prizes there and probably keep Stahele's cavalry from coming to the front by giving them plenty to do in their rear, so we kept ourselves concealed, like Robin Hood and his merry men, in the green wood until night, and then sallied out in quest of game. After it was dark, we moved to a point about 4 miles below Aldie, where Pleasanton and Rosser had been fighting, and on the pike leading to Fairfax Courthouse, near which Hooker's headquarters were established that evening. My command was now inside of Hooker's lines, and environed on all sides by the camps of his different corps. Along the pike a continuous stream of troops with all the impedimenta of war poured along. Taking 3 men with me, Joe Nelson, Charlie Hall, and Norman Smith, I rode out into the column of Union troops as they passed along. As it was dark, they had no suspicion who we were, although we were all dressed in full Confederate uniform. A man by the name of Birch lived in a house near the roadside, and I discovered 3 horses standing at his front gate, with a man holding them by their bridles. I was sure that he was an orderly, and that they were officers' horses. We rode up, and asked him to whom they belonged. He replied that they were Major Sterling's and Captain Fisher's, and that they were just from General Hooker's headquarters. I then called him up to me and took him by the collar, and leaning down whispered in his ear, "You are my prisoner. My name is Mosby." The man, who was an Irishman, understood me to say that he was Mosby, and indignantly replied, "You are a d liar. I am as good a Union man as you are." Just then in the starlight he saw the gleam of a pistol, and had nothing further to say. In a few minutes the officers came out of the house. I saluted them, and asked which way they were going and where they were from. As we seemed to be in such friendly relations with their orderly, they never suspected our hostile character, and promptly answered that they were from General Hooker's headquarters and were carrying dispatches to Pleasanton. Captain Fisher was his chief signal officer, going up to establish a signal station at Snicker's Gap. If he could get there. By this time my men had dismounted, and as I was talking to Major Sterling, Joe Nelson walked up and, politely extending his hand, asked for his pistol. Charlie Hall, not to be outdone in courtesy by Joe, proposed to relieve Captain Fisher of his. They both misunderstood what Hall and Nelson meant, and offered to shake hands with them. In an instant the barrels of 4 glittering revolvers informed them that death was their doom if they refused to be prisoners. Resistance was useless, and they surrendered. All now mounted quickly, and we left the pike. As we started, both officers burst out laughing. I asked them what they were laughing at. They said they had laughed so much about their people being gobbled up by me that they were now enjoying the joke being turned on themselves. They were then informed that I knew that they had dispatches for Pleasanton, and that they could relieve me of performing a disagreeable duty by handing them over. Major Sterling promptly complied. I then went to a farmer's house nearby, got a light, and read them. They contained just such information as General Lee wanted, and were the open sesame to Hooker's army. I wrote a note to Stuart to go with the dispatches, which were sent with the prisoners under charge of Norman Smith. He got to Stuart's headquarters about daybreak. The skies were red that night in every direction with the light of the fires of the Union Army. We slept soundly within a mile of Birney's corps at Gum Spring, and in the morning began operations on the pike. We soon got as many fish in our nets as we could haul out, and then returned into the Confederate lines. Stuart was delighted to see me. He had also learned from the captured dispatches that a cavalry reconnaissance would be sent to Warrenton the next day. Notice of it was sent to General Hampton, who met and repulsed it. Stuart's report of the Gettysburg campaign says, Major Mosby, with his usual daring, penetrated the enemy's lines and caught a staff officer of General Hooker, bearer of dispatches to General Pleasanton, commanding United States cavalry near Aldie. These dispatches disclosed the fact that Hooker was looking to Aldie with solicitude, and that Pleasanton, with infantry and cavalry, occupied the place, and that a reconnaissance in force of cavalry was meditated toward Warrenton and Culpeper. I immediately dispatched to General Hampton, who was coming by way of Warrenton from the direction of Beverly Ford, this intelligence, and directed him to meet this advance at Warrenton. The captured dispatches also gave the entire number of divisions, from which we could estimate the approximate strength of the enemy's army. I therefore concluded in no event to attack with cavalry alone the enemy at Aldie. Hampton met the enemy's advance toward Culpeper and Warrenton, and drove him back without difficulty, a heavy storm and night intervening to aid the enemy's retreat. After a series of indecisive engagements extending through several days, Pleasanton, finally, on the 21st of June, supported by a force of infantry, drove Stuart back to Ashby's Gap in the Blue Ridge. Having effected the object of his reconnaissance, which was to ascertain the position of the Confederate army that was then moving down the Shenandoah Valley, Pleasanton retired. On the same night to Aldie, where the 5th Corps was posted, and did not again assume the offensive as long as Hooker remained in Virginia. He stood on the defensive and simply watched and waited. On the next day, Stuart re-established his lines about Middleburg, with his headquarters at Rector's Crossroads, where he kept up communication with General Lee, who was at Berryville. Hill and Longstreet were near there, and Ewell had gone into Maryland. On the afternoon when Pleasanton followed the Confederate cavalry through Upperville to the mountain, I was with my command on Dulany's farm, about a mile from the pike, as he passed. I determined again to strike at his rear. As we were passing Bull Run Mountain by a narrow path that night, one of my men, about the middle of the column, dropped his hat and stopped to pick it up. It was pitch dark, and as those in front of him knew nothing about it, they kept on. The men behind him halted. This cut my column in two, and half of it wandered all night in the woods, but never found me. We slept in a drenching rain on the top of the mountain, and started early in the morning. As we were going through Dr. Ewell's farm, I stopped to talk with him, but the men went on. Presently I saw them halt near a church in the woods, and one of them beckoned to me. I galloped up, and saw a body of about 30 cavalry drawn up not 100 yards in front of us. I instantly ordered a charge, and just as we got upon them, they ran away, while a heavy fire was poured into us by a company of infantry concealed in the church. A Negro had carried the news of our being on the mountain to General Meade, who had prepared this ambuscade for me. 3 of my men, Charlie Hall, Mountjoy, and Ballard, were wounded, the latter losing a leg. The lieutenant commanding the Federal cavalry was killed. I was not 10 steps from the infantry when they fired the volley. We fell back to the mountain, and no doubt General Meade thought that I was done for, at least for that day. After taking care of my wounded, I started again for the Little River Pike, which we reached by flanking General Meade. Pretty soon we caught a train of 20 wagons and proceeded to unhitch the mules. I did not have more than 1 man to a wagon. The guard to the train rallied and recaptured some of the animals, and 2 of my men, but we got away with most of them. That night they were delivered to Stuart's quartermaster. This raid is a fine illustration of the great results that may be achieved by a partisan force cooperating with the movements of an army. My principal aim in these operations was to get information for Stuart and, by harassing the communications of the Federal Army, to neutralize with my small command Stahel's 3 brigades of cavalry in Fairfax. 9. General Stahel, in a report to the Secretary of War, says that on June 21st he received an order from Hooker's headquarters to make a reconnaissance in force to Warrenton and the Upper Rappahannock. In compliance with this order, he says, I started with my command for Warrenton and the Upper Rappahannock. Just as I was about crossing the Rappahannock with 2 brigades, one of my brigades being already across for the purpose of executing the above orders, and to break up General Lee's communication with Richmond, and which could have been easily effected as there were but very few troops, and General Lee's rear consisting of their cavalry, with which General Pleasanton was engaged in the upper part of the valley, received the following order from Hooker. June 23, Major General Hancock, direct General Stahel to return without delay, to dispose his forces so as to catch the party inside our lines if possible. Another despatch stated that the force was about 100, that they attacked one of our trains on the Aldie Road. It was with feelings of bitter regret and disappointment that I received this order, inasmuch as I was just crossing the Rappahannock with 3 brigades of cavalry and a battery of horse artillery, who were just fresh from camp, etc. All of Lee's supplies had to pass up between the Rappahannock and Blue Ridge Mountains, or cross to the Shenandoah Valley, and my force was sufficient to have destroyed his entire trains and to cut off General Lee completely from his supplies. I was compelled by this order to abandon my movement, and restrained from dealing so fatal a blow to the enemy, and return with my whole division to disperse about 100 guerrillas who had escaped back out of our lines before I ever received the order to return. It happened that on June 22, the very day we captured the wagon train, General Stahel, in obedience to Hooker's orders, had gone from Fairfax with 3 cavalry brigades and a battery of artillery on a reconnaissance to the Rappahannock. On June 23, just as one of his brigades had crossed over the river and the other 2 were in the act of crossing, he received an order from General Hooker to return immediately and to dispose his force so as to catch the party inside his lines that had captured his wagon train. We had got to Stuart's headquarters with Hooker's mules before Stahel got the order. He did not come there to search for them. If he had not been recalled, he might have done much damage on General Lee's line of communication, as it was entirely uncovered. In fact, there was no Confederate force between him and Richmond when afterward General Hooker, before the Committee on the Conduct of the War, criticized the authorities at Washington so severely for keeping this large force to watch my small one. He had forgotten that he had done the same thing himself. 10. In a letter to Stuart, dated June 23, 1863, 5 pesos M., General Lee refers with some uneasiness to this expedition of Stahel. He did not know at the time that Stahel had gone back. In an interview I had with Stuart on my return, we discussed the best route for him to go into Maryland. As I knew all the roads as well as the location of each corps of the enemy, that were all wide apart, I thought he ought to go through an unguarded gap of the Bull Run Mountain, and, cutting his way right through the middle of the Union Army, crossed the Potomac at Seneca. 11. It was the shortest route he could go into Maryland, and there was a splendid opportunity to destroy Hooker's transportation as he went along, and to cut off communication between Washington and the North. The plan was at that time perfectly practicable. Hooker was in a defensive attitude, waiting the development of Lee's plans, and only a small portion of the cavalry was necessary to be held in our front to observe the enemy and report their movements to the commanding general. The plan was to leave 2 brigades of cavalry about Middleburg to do this work, while Stuart, with 3 brigades, should pass through Hooker's army into Maryland. The brigades selected to be left behind were those of Jones and Beverly H. Robertson, under command of the latter, who happened to be the ranking officer. They numbered over 3,000 men and exceeded in strength the 3 that Stuart took with him. 10. Gainesville, 11 a.m., June 23, 1863. Stahel to Butterfield, Chief of Staff to Hooker. Your order to return without delay received through Major General Hancock. After midnight, made arrangements at once, and my advance arrived here from Warrenton this morning at 8 o'clock. In accordance with your order, I shall scout the whole country, from Bull Run Mountain toward Fairfax Courthouse, and have ordered the rest of my command and my train to Fairfax, where I shall report personally to you. 11. It now appears from their correspondence that Stuart, Longstreet, and General Lee had already been discussing the feasibility of his going this route. As Hancock's corps was holding Hopewell and Thoroughfare Gaps, the road that Stuart determined to go was through Glasscock's Gap a few miles south of Thoroughfare via Haymarket, through Loudon to Seneca Ford on the Potomac. The part assigned to me was to cross the Bull Run at night by the bridle path I had so frequently traveled, and, uniting with Stuart near Gum Spring and Loudon, take command of his advance guard. Hooker's headquarters were still at Fairfax Station, with his army spread out like a fan over Loudon, Prince William, and Fairfax counties, his left being at Thoroughfare, his right at Leesburg, with his center at Aldie, and Pleasanton's cavalry in front of it. Stuart's plan, of course, contemplated his crossing of the river in advance of Hooker or Lee, and opening communication with Ewell as soon as he was over. During our interview, General Hampton and Fitz Lee came into the room, and soon afterward Stuart started a courier off to General Lee. I have been informed by one of his staff that he rode over to Berryville that day to have a personal interview with the commanding general. Before we parted, he told me that General Lee was very apprehensive that Hooker would steal a march and get into Maryland ahead of him, and asked me to go and find out if any portion of his army was crossing the river. Although I had been almost continuously in the saddle for 3 days and nights, I agreed to return inside of Hooker's lines. With only 2 men, I crossed the Bull Run again that night, and early the next morning was riding in full Confederate uniform through the Union Army. I soon sent Stuart a dispatch that I was certain Hooker's army was not in motion. Proceeding some distance down the pike with my single companion, we had stopped to talk with a citizen, when 4 lieutenants belonging to the 3D Corps, that was camped nearby, walked up to us. There was a drizzling rain, and we had waterproofs thrown over our shoulders. As they were in full view of their camps, they had no suspicion of danger and were without arms. After talking with them for some minutes, they were stunned by a demand for their surrender. I sent them back under guard of 1 man, with another dispatch to Stuart. I then rode on alone down into Fairfax, where I met some of my old acquaintances, who thought when they first saw me that it was my ghost. Having learned all about the situation of Hooker's army, I started back. I stopped at the house of John I. Coleman to inquire the shortest way to the pike. It was the first time he ever saw me, and, although I showed him my gray uniform and star, he thought I was trying to play a Yankee trick on him, and refused to tell me anything. While we were talking, I heard a noise behind me. Turning around, I saw 2 mounted men approaching us. When within about 50 yards, they stopped and began picking cherries from a tree. I drew my pistol, but kept it under my gum cloth and rode up to them. They never suspected that I was an enemy. I asked them where they were from. They answered that they were on duty with Reynolds's corps that was camped nearby at Guilford. They had no arms, so, of course, had to surrender. When Coleman saw this affair, he was more convinced than ever that I was a Yankee dressed up in gray. I had to get to the pike the best way I could, so I tied the heads of my prisoners' horses together with their halters, to keep them from running away, and went on. It was near sunset when I came in sight of the pike, about 4 miles below Aldie. There was a wagon train a mile or so in length passing on the road, with a strong cavalry guard that was carrying supplies to the troops above. I was anxious to get to Stuart that night, and knew that if I waited for the train to pass it would be dark, and I could not find the mountain path. So I drew my pistol, held it under cover, and told my prisoners that if they spoke a word they would be dead men. I then rode, with them by my side, through a gap in the fence into the pike, right among the Union cavalry. We could not cross over at that point, as the fence on the other side of the road was too high for our horses to leap. We went along for 200 yards, with my prisoners, through the wagon train and cavalry escort, until we got to a road leading away from the pike. Here we turned off. The gum cloth I had over my shoulders to protect me from the rain, as it did not cover 1/3 of my body, did not conceal the uniform I wore. I had ridden through the ranks of a column of Union cavalry in broad daylight with 2 prisoners, and my elbow had actually struck against one as I passed. In doing so, I had acted on the maxim of Danton Audace, toujours audace, finding that I could not reach the mountain before night, and fearing to go to sleep in the woods alone with my prisoners, I took their paroles and sent them back to their friends. Of course, I kept their horses. Early the next morning, I was again at Stuart's headquarters. 12 Stuart's report says, I resumed my own position now, at Rector's Cross Roads, and being in constant communication with the commanding general, had scouts busily employed watching and reporting the enemy's movements, and reporting the same to the commanding general. In this difficult search, the fearless and indefatigable Major Mosby was particularly active and efficient. His information was always accurate and reliable. Stuart had now received his final instructions from General Lee, authorizing him to move into Maryland, around the rear of the enemy and between him and Washington. He was likewise instructed to do them all the damage he could on his way. With his transportation destroyed and communications broken, Hooker would be seriously embarrassed in pursuing General Lee, or probably forced to fall back for supplies, or to defend the capital against this demonstration. In the meantime, while Hooker was thus delayed, the Confederates would have been levying contributions on the farmers in Pennsylvania. His original plan, which was bold in conception and perfectly practicable in execution, was thwarted by an event which he could not control. It was obvious now that Hooker would not initiate any movement, but would confine himself to covering the capital and observing his adversary. It was equally plain that when the Confederate army made a move west of the Blue Ridge, Hooker would make a corresponding one on the east. It was therefore all important for the success of Stuart's movement that the status quo of the 2 armies should be preserved until he could get through Hooker's army to the river, when it would be too late for Hooker to take any step to defeat it. The distance was not more than 20 miles to the Potomac from the point where he would enter Hooker's lines, and this could be got over between sunrise and sundown, as he intended to march in 3 parallel columns. He knew the country well, and the position of each corps, and it would have been easy enough for him to flank them. Before Pleasanton could have got ready to follow the blazing meteor, it would have been out of sight. The 3 brigades that were to accompany Stuart were quietly withdrawn from Pleasanton's front on the evening of June 24, and marched in a southerly direction to their rendezvous at Salem. Those of Jones and Robertson were put in the position they had held about Middleburg, and of course were charged with the ordinary duty of cavalry on a post of observation, as General Stuart says in his report, and Robertson's and Jones's brigades, under command of the former, were left in observation of the enemy. On the usual front, about Middleburg, with full instructions as to following of the enemy, in case of withdrawal and joining our main army. An order to a cavalry officer to observe an enemy of course implies that he is to report what he sees, otherwise there is no use in his observing. Stuart left behind a force of over 3,000 cavalry, which was amply sufficient for every purpose. By daybreak on the morning of the 25th, his column debouched through Glassock's Gap, in the Bull Run, and proceeded towards Haymarket. At the same time I started across by the route I had been traveling for a week, to connect with him at the appointed place. We had stopped at a spring on the mountainside to make our breakfast on some sutler's stores that had been saved from our captives. 2 men had been sent forward on a picket, but they had scarcely got 100 yards before a volley was fired, and the bullets whistled all around us. We sprang upon our horses, but, as the men did not return, we knew that they must have been killed or captured. General Meade, whose camps were nearby, had prepared an ambuscade a second time for me, but I had escaped. I wonder if he would have called this. We made a detour around them, and hurried on to join Stuart, as we could hear his cannon about Haymarket. It seems that when Stuart got there, he found the roads on which he intended to march that day occupied by Hancock's corps, that had broken up camp that morning, and was moving towards the Potomac. When I got to the Little River Pike, about 8 miles below Aldie, which was to be our point of junction, instead of meeting him, we struck the head of Hancock's column. His divisions were marching on every road. I spent the day and night riding about among them, and with great difficulty extricated myself from the dilemma in which I was placed. I could not find out where Stuart was, nor he where I was, for Hancock was between us. So I retraced my steps and went on to Pennsylvania through the Shenandoah Valley, passing General Robertson's command. That was quietly, resting in Ashby's and Snicker's Gaps in the Blue Ridge, after the enemy retired on the 26th. Pleasanton that day had moved by his flank across General Robertson's front to Leesburg, to cover the crossing of Hooker's army. Why he should have halted and remained idle 3 days in the gaps of the Blue Ridge in Virginia after both armies had marched into Pennsylvania is a mystery that has never been satisfactorily explained. If there were any sound military reasons for his staying there 3 and 3 days, there were equally as sound ones for his not leaving at all. His proper position was on General Lee's flank, next to the enemy, in order to protect his rear and to keep him informed of their movement. If General Robertson had then, in obedience to General Lee's and Stuart's instructions, promptly followed the enemy along the base of South Mountain through Boonesboro, the Confederate cavalry might easily have reached Gettysburg in advance of the Federal troops. In this event there would not have been the accidental collision of armies. General Lee would have fought a defensive battle, and Gettysburg might have been to Southern hearts something more than a glorious field of grief. Even as it was, Stuart's movement around his rear had so confused General Meade that his army was more scattered than ours, and 2 of his corps in the first day's fight were caught in delicto and crushed. He was looking for Lee on the Susquehanna, when in fact he was concentrating on Gettysburg. On account of Hancock's unexpected movement, Stuart had been compelled to make a wider circuit than he had intended, and did not cross the Potomac until the night of the 27th, the day after Hooker got over. He thence moved northerly towards the Susquehanna to put himself on Ewell's flank in accordance with the instructions of General Lee. But owing to the derangement of his plans by the advance of the Union Army without General Robertson having given him notice of it, Ewell had been recalled and Stuart did not join the army until July the 2nd, at Gettysburg when the battle was raging. But Robertson's command had not even then come up. This movement of Stuart's around the rear of Hooker's army has been condemned by General Long, the military secretary and biographer of General Lee, as having been undertaken either from misapprehension of his instructions or love of the eclat of a bold raid, which, of course, implies disobedience of Orders 13, and General Longstreet says that as he was leaving the Blue Ridge, he instructed Stuart to follow him down the valley and cross the Potomac at Shepherdstown, but that Stuart replied that he had discretionary powers from General Lee where to cross the Potomac. 13. In the memoirs of General Lee, p. 271, General Long says, previous to the passage of the Potomac, General Stuart was instructed to make the movements of the cavalry correspond with those of the Federal Army, so that he might be in position to observe and report all important information. In the performance of this duty, Stuart had never failed, and probably his great confidence in him made Lee less specific in his instructions than he would otherwise have been, but on this occasion, either from the misapprehension of instructions or the love of the eclat of a bold raid, Stuart, instead of maintaining his appropriate position between the armies, placed himself on the right flank of the enemy, where his communication with Lee was effectually severed. This greatly embarrassed the movements of General Lee and eventually forced him to an engagement under disadvantageous circumstances. In the Century magazine, General Longstreet, in his article on Gettysburg, says, "When Hill with his troops and well-supplied trains had passed my rear, I was ordered to withdraw from the Blue Ridge, pass over to the west of the Shenandoah, and to follow the movements of the other troops, only to cross the Potomac at Williamsport. I ordered General Stuart, whom I considered under my command, to occupy the gaps with a part of his cavalry and to follow with his main force on my right, to cross the Potomac at Shepherdstown and move on my right flank. Upon giving him this order, he informed me that he had authority from General Lee to occupy the gaps with a part of his cavalry and to follow the Federal Army with the remainder. At the same time, he expressed his purpose of crossing the river east of the Blue Ridge and trying to make way around the right of the Federal Army. So I moved my troops independent of the cavalry, following my orders, crossed at Williamsport, come up with a pea hill in Maryland, and we moved on thence to Chambersburg. On the 30th of June, we turned our faces toward our enemy and marched upon Gettysburg. The 3rd Corps, under Hill, moved out first, and my command followed. We then found ourselves in a very unusual condition. We were almost in the immediate presence of the enemy, with our cavalry gone. Stuart was undertaking another wild ride around the Federal Army. We knew nothing of Meade's movements further than the report my scout had made. We did not know, except by surmises, when or where to expect to find Meade, nor whether he was lying in wait or advancing. General Longstreet will find it difficult to reconcile what he now says were his orders to the cavalry with his letter to Stuart, or the following one to General Lee. Headquarters, June 22, 1863, 7:30 p.m. General R. E. Lee, Ta Com G. Ant Seek. General, yours of 40C. This afternoon is wrecked. I have forwarded your letters to General Stuart with the suggestion that he pass by the enemy's rear, if he thinks that he may get through. We have nothing of the enemy today. Most respectfully, J. Longstreet, 1T, General Combg. So it appears that it was General Longstreet who suggested to Stuart the idea of another wild ride around the Federal Army. When this charge was made against Stuart, both the critics were viewing his movement in the light of the disaster to our arms at Gettysburg, and it was more agreeable to put the blame of it on a dead man than a living one. General Long, who had access to the Confederate archives, may plead the blindness with which he is afflicted as an excuse for his error, and I have no doubt that General Longstreet has forgotten that his own letter to Stuart contradicts his statement. General Lee made 2 reports of this campaign, one written in July 1863, a few weeks after the battle, and a more detailed one in January 1864. There is a slight color of truth in the imputation cast upon Stuart that General Lee intended to censure him in his report, but this is owing to a false interpretation given to it by persons who have construed a single sentence literally, and not in connection with others that qualify and explain it. 14 General Lee does say it was expected that as soon as the Federal Army should cross the Potomac, Gen. Stuart would give notice of its movements, and nothing having been heard from him since our entrance into Maryland, it was inferred that the enemy had not yet left Virginia. Orders were therefore issued to move on Harrisburg. Now, if all that General Lee says in his report about Stuart's cavalry is read together as a whole, it is apparent that in the sentence above quoted, he uses in Stuart's name not in a personal sense, but descriptive of his cavalry corps, for in another place. He says that Stuart had been directed to divide his cavalry, leaving a portion to watch the enemy in front of the mountain passes in Virginia, and with the remainder to cross into Maryland and place himself on the right of General Ewell, who was marching on Harrisburg. 14. General Lee says in the meantime the progress of Ewell, who was already in Maryland with Jenkins' cavalry, advanced into Pennsylvania as far as Chambersburg, rendered it necessary that the rest of the army should be within supporting distance, and Hill having reached the valley, Longstreet was withdrawn to the west side of the Shenandoah, and the two corps encamped near Berryville. General Stuart was directed to hold the mountain passes with part of his command as long as the enemy remained south of the Potomac, and with the remainder to cross into Maryland and place himself on the right of General Ewell. Upon the suggestion of the former officer that he could damage the enemy and delay his passage of the river by getting in his rear, he was authorized to do so, and it was left to his discretion whether to enter Maryland east or west of the Blue Ridge. But he was instructed to lose no time in placing his command on the right of our column as soon as he perceived the enemy moving northward. The expedition of General Early to York was designed in part to prepare for this undertaking by breaking the railroad between Baltimore and Harrisburg and seizing the bridge over the Susquehanna at Wrightsville. The advance against Harrisburg was arrested by intelligence received from a scout on the night of the 28th, to the effect that the army of General Hooker had crossed the Potomac and was approaching the mountains. In the absence of the cavalry, it was impossible to ascertain his intentions, but to deter him from advancing farther west and intercepting our communications with Virginia, it was determined to concentrate the army east of the mountains. The movement of the army preceding the Battle of Gettysburg had been much embarrassed by the absence of the cavalry. As soon as it was known that the enemy had crossed into Maryland, orders were sent to the brigades of B. H. Robertson and W. M. E. Jones, which had been left, to guard the passes of the Blue Ridge, to rejoin the army without delay, and it was expected that General Stuart, with the remainder of his command, would soon arrive. In the exercise of the discretion given him when Longstreet and Hill marched into Maryland, General Stuart determined to pass around the rear of the Federal Army with 3 brigades and cross the Potomac between it and Washington, believing that by that route he would be able to place himself on our right flank in time to keep us properly advised of the enemy's movements. He marched from Salem on the night of June 24th, intending to pass west of Centreville, but found the enemy's forces so distributed as to render that route impracticable. Adhering to his original plan, he was forced to make a wide detour through Buckland and Brentsville, and cross the Occoquan at Wolf Run Shoals on the morning of the 27th. Continuing his march through Fairfax Courthouse and Drainesville, he arrived at the Potomac below the mouth of Seneca Creek in the evening. He found the river much swollen by the recent rains, but after great exertion gained the Maryland shore before midnight with his whole command. He now ascertained that the whole Federal army, which he had discovered to be drawing towards the Potomac, had crossed the day before and was moving towards Fredericktown, thus interposing itself between him and our forces. Robertson's and Jones's brigades arrived on July 3d and were stationed upon our right flank. The severe loss sustained by the army and the reduction of its ammunition rendered another attempt to dislodge the enemy inadvisable, and it was therefore determined upon to withdraw. 15 Stuart has been criticized for carrying into our lines a train of 125 wagons, which he captured in Maryland, with supplies for Hooker, on account of the delay it produced in joining General Lee. But the expedition has been condemned, not as an independent raid, but because it is said that it deprived General Lee of his cavalry, which ought to have given him notice of Hooker's advance into Pennsylvania. But as General Lee actually received notice of it on the very night that Stuart crossed the Potomac, it is hard to see what harm was done by taking the wagons with him, and I have shown that Stuart left with General Lee sufficient cavalry to do the work of guarding his flank and observing the enemy. Clearly, General Lee did not intend to involve himself in the contradiction of saying that he expected Stuart impersonally to perform at the same time the double duty of watching Hooker along the Potomac and guarding Ewell's flank on the Susquehanna. 16 General Lee, in thus referring to Stuart, was somewhat careless and inaccurate in his language, as he was when, in describing the Battle of Gettysburg, he said that Robertson's command arrived on July 3rd D, when in fact it never got nearer than Cashtown, some 8 miles from the battlefield. But General Lee is explicit in saying, on his report, that he gave Stuart full authority to make the movement around the enemy's rear. Among the Confederate archives in Washington, I have at last found in General Lee's confidential letter book his final instructions to Stuart, which have never been published, which must set this controverted question at rest forever. At the time when they were written, General Lee's headquarters were at Berryville. They are dated June 23, 1863, 5 p.m. 16. So far as keeping General Lee informed of Hooker's movements is concerned, it was immaterial whether Stuart crossed east or west of the ridge. In either event, he would have been separated from General Lee and unable to watch the line of the Potomac. Stuart was ordered down to take 3 brigades to the Susquehanna and to leave 2 behind him to watch Hooker. He was simply given discretion as to the point of crossing the Potomac. He is not responsible for the division of his command. In them, General Lee presents to Stuart the alternative of crossing the Potomac west of the Blue Ridge at Shepherdstown and moving over to Frederick, M.D., or she will, however, be able to judge whether you can pass around their army without hindrance, doing them all the damage you can, and cross the river east of the mountains. In either case, after crossing the river, you must move on and feel the right of Ewell's troops, collecting information, provisions, etc. In a letter to Stuart dated June 22, he had said, "If you find that he is moving northward and that 2 brigades can guard the Blue Ridge and take care of your rear, you can move with the other 3 into Maryland and take position on General Ewell's right. Place yourself in communication with him, guard his flank, and keep him informed of the enemy's movements, and collect all the supplies you can for the use of the army. 1 column of General Ewell's army will probably move towards the Susquehanna by the Emmitsburg route, another by Chambersburg." The intention of General Lee clearly was that Stuart, with 1 portion of the cavalry, was to guard Ewell's flank and give him information of the enemy. The other was to be left 17 behind, as he says in his report, to hold the mountain passes as long as the enemy remained south of the Potomac. To suppose that General Lee intended them to remain there after the enemy had gone is to suppose that he was not only unfit to command an army, but even a corporal's guard. It is clear that he intended the 2 brigades under Robertson to perform the same service for the column of Longstreet and Hill, with whom he had his headquarters, as Stuart was to do for Ewell, who was separated from him. When these 2 corps crossed the Potomac on the 25th, he knew that Stuart had not crossed west of the ridge in advance of them. He would not have committed the blunder of marching all his infantry into Pennsylvania, knowing that all his cavalry was in Virginia. He must therefore have expected for Stuart to cross the Potomac on the same day to the east of the ridge, which he would have done but for Hancock's movement. Some have contended that his anxious inquiries for Stuart when he got to Chambersburg proved that he did not know which way he had gone. They only show that he did not know where Stuart was, and at that time, as Stuart had been directed to open communication as soon as he got into Pennsylvania with Ewell, and had not been able to do so on account of the Federal Army getting between them, General Lee, not having heard from him, very naturally felt a great deal of solicitude for his safety. If General Lee had not thought that he would cross the Potomac somewhere on the same day that he did, he would have waited and sent for him. But again, General Lee would not assume the responsibility of authorizing Stuart to go around Hooker's rear unless the movement had the approval of General Longstreet, whose headquarters were at Millwood, not far from Berryville. General Lee's instructions to Stuart were therefore sent through Longstreet. In a letter to Stuart, Longstreet not only approves of Stuart's going into Maryland around the rear of the enemy, but opposes his going the other route through the Shenandoah Valley, on the ground that it would disclose their plans to the enemy. In concluding his letter, he says, "I think that your passage of the Potomac by our rear at the present moment will in a measure disclose our plans. You had better not leave us, therefore, unless you can take the proposed route in rear of the enemy." By our rear, Longstreet meant through the Shenandoah Valley. The reasons he gave Stuart were conclusive in favor of the course he took. It was General Lee's policy to detain Hooker as long as possible in Virginia, but if Stuart passed to the west of the ridge and crossed the Potomac at Shepherdstown, he would be discovered by the signal stations of the enemy on Maryland Heights. This would indicate, of course, that the infantry was to follow him. On the contrary, Hooker would interpret a movement around his rear as nothing more than a cavalry raid, and it would be a mask to conceal Lee's designs. It was no fault of Stuart's that he was unable to execute his plan. On June 22, 18:00 p.m., General Lee, writing from Berryville, VA to Ewell, who was then about Hagerstown, MD, says, "My letter of today, authorizing you to move toward the Susquehanna, I hope has reached you ere this. I have also directed General Stuart, should the enemy have so far retired from his front, as to permit of the departure of a portion of the cavalry to march with 3 brigades across the Potomac and place himself on your right and in communication with you, keep you advised of the movements of the enemy, and assist in collecting supplies for the army. I have not heard from him since." As Stuart was not ubiquitous, General Lee must have relied on the cavalry left behind to do for him what he intended that Stuart should do for Ewell. The Count of Paris says that it was impracticable from the first, and differed in its condition from his other operations of this kind, because they were undertaken while the armies were both stationary. Now, at the time when Stuart resolved on going into Maryland by this route, both armies were as stationary as when he rode around McClellan on the Chickahominy, and Hooker was waiting for the Confederates to move, but it could not be expected for Hooker to stand still while his adversary was in motion. Now it so happened that the corps of Longstreet and Hill moved from Berryville on June 24 towards the Potomac, which they crossed the next day, Hill at Shepherdstown and Longstreet at Williamsport. 18. Their route of march was in plain view of Maryland Heights, and the news was immediately telegraphed from there by General Tyler. This set the whole of Hooker's army in motion on the morning of the 25th for the Potomac, about the time, therefore, that Stuart's column appeared on the eastern side of Bull Run. On the morning of the 25th, Hancock broke up camp and started on the same road that Stuart intended to march. Hancock was ahead of him and had the right of way. General Longstreet had urged Stuart to go that route for fear that if he went through the Shenandoah Valley, the plans of the commanding general would be disclosed to the enemy. 18. Maryland Heights, June 24, 1863. H.W. Halleck, General-in-Chief. Longstreet's corps, which camped last between Berryville and Charlestown, is today in motion, and before 6:00 C. This morning commenced crossing by the ford 1 mile below Shepherdstown to Sharpsburg. General Tyler, Brigadier General. I am unable to understand why he could not foresee that the march of all the Confederate infantry in full view of the enemy would have the same effect. If the corps of Longstreet and Hill had delayed a single day in leaving Berryville, Stuart would have landed on the north bank of the Potomac on the night of the 25th. Hooker would then have been utterly confounded. Before he could have made up his mind what to do, the Confederate cavalry would have been watering their horses in the Susquehanna, and all the communications between Washington and the North would have been broken. But now to return to the cavalry which Stuart, under General Lee's orders, had left in front of the enemy in Virginia, as he says, and to observe his movements and follow him in case of withdrawal. Of course, this duty could not be discharged without keeping in sight of the enemy. But instead of following, they fell back in an opposite direction and gave no information to General Lee and no trouble to the enemy. General Lee says that on the night of the 28th he heard through a scout that had come in that Hooker was over the river and was moving north. He is mistaken as to the date, as there is a letter of his to General Ewell, dated Chambersburg, June 28, 7:30 a.m., which says, "I wrote you once last night stating that General Hooker was reported to have crossed the Potomac and is advancing by way of Middletown, the head of his column being at that point in Frederick County, MD. He directs Ewell to move to Gettysburg, which had become to him what Quatre Bras was to Wellington. When he learned that Napoleon was over the Sambre, in his report of the campaign, General Lee says that as soon as it was known that the enemy had crossed into Maryland, orders were sent to General Robertson to rejoin the army without delay. The very fact that General Lee had to send back for this cavalry shows that it was in the wrong place, and where he did not intend it to be. In his instructions to Stuart when leaving, he had said, "And give instructions to the commander of the brigades left behind, to watch the flank and rear of the army, and in event of the enemy leaving their front, retire from the mountains west of the Shenandoah, leaving sufficient pickets to guard the passes, bringing everything clean along the valley close upon the rear of the army." It is clear that the instructions to General Robertson were to leave Virginia when the enemy left. For how could he otherwise watch the flank and rear of the Confederate army, and be close upon? It. General Robertson 19 says that during the time he was lying in the gaps of the Virginia mountains, after the enemy had crossed the river, he was in daily communication by couriers with General Lee's headquarters. 20. Then so much the worse if he did not inform him that the enemy had disappeared from his front. The inquiry is now naturally suggested, what did he communicate? See his letter of December 27, in a 20. Stewart's report says, I submitted to the commanding general the plan of leaving a brigade or so in my present front, and passing through Hopewell or some other gap in the Bull Run Mountain, attain the enemy's rear, passing between his main body and Washington, cross into Maryland, joining our army north of the Potomac. The commanding general wrote to me, authorizing this move if I deemed it practicable, and also what instructions should be given the officer left in command of the 2 brigades left in front of the enemy. He also notified me that one column should move via Gettysburg and the other via Carlisle towards the Susquehanna, and directed me, after crossing, to proceed with all dispatch to join the right early of the army in Pennsylvania. Robertson's and Jones's brigades, under command of the former, were left in observation of the enemy on the usual front, and full instructions as to following up the enemy in case of withdrawal and rejoining our main army. This report was read by General Lee, and not one word of dissent by him is endorsed on it. It bears his initials in pencil, R.E.L., in his own handwriting. Again he says, he, General Lee, was fully aware of my position and the specific duty I was then performing. But what that specific duty was no one knows. If General Lee ordered him to remain there unemployed, then he could blame no one but himself for the want of cavalry, and the responsibility would rest on him. 21. But the fact that General Lee sent for him to join the army as soon as he heard that the enemy was advancing north is proof that he never intended him to stay in Virginia after they had gone. General Lee had issued orders from Chambersburg for the concentration of his army at Gettysburg, and, as he says, sent back for Robertson's command to join the army without delay. When the order was read, General Robertson marched his 2 brigades that night to Berryville, which is west of the mountain, on a route almost parallel and in an opposite direction from Gettysburg, which is east of it. On June 30th he continued his westerly and circuitous march to Martinsburg, and on July 1st, the day of the battle, crossed the Potomac at Williamsport. If he had crossed at Shepherdstown and gone to Boonesboro, he might easily have reached Gettysburg after receiving General Lee's order on the morning of July 1st, when it was held by Buford with only 2 brigades of cavalry. General Meade had sent off most of his cavalry in search of Stuart. It was this diversion created by Stuart that saved General Lee's communications from attack. Buford was too weak to assume the offensive. On June 24, when General Lee moved with Longstreet and Hill down the Shenandoah Valley, he left General Robertson's command between him and the enemy on July 3rd. General Robertson had so maneuvered that Lee had got between him and the enemy. Stuart had ridden around General Hooker, while General Robertson rode around General Lee. Sicatur ad astra. 21. General Robertson says that when he received General Lee's order, he was at Ashby's Gap in the Blue Ridge in Fauquier County. Jones's brigade was 12 miles farther north, at Snicker's Gap in Loudon, and joined him at Berryville. Stuart had placed them about 15 miles to the front of the gaps at Middleburg to watch the enemy. After he left, they retired to the mountain and rendered General Lee no more service while there than if they had been west of the Mississippi. There are reports of their operations on file from all the brigade and regimental commanders of the cavalry in this campaign, unexcept General Robertson, who, at his own request, was relieved of his command as soon as he returned to Virginia. Since the above was written, I have found in the archives of the War Office a copy of Stuart's orders to General Robertson when leaving Virginia. But he does not appear to have been in the least governed by them. They confirm all I have said as to the duty required of the cavalry that were left under his command. Through abundant caution, Stuart repeated them to General Jones. He was instructed to watch the enemy and report their movements through a line of relay couriers to General Longstreet. And when the enemy withdrew, to harass his rear and impede his march, and follow on the right of our army. There seems to have been no effort made to execute these orders, for both Gens Lee and Longstreet say that no intelligence having been received through the cavalry of Hooker's crossing the Potomac, it was supposed that he was still south of it, while Pleasonton says that he never had a skirmish in retiring. The fact that Pleasonton's cavalry corps reached Leesburg by noon of the 26th shows that they must have left General Robertson's front at Aldie early that morning. In a dispatch 22 from Leesburg to Hooker's headquarters dated June 26, 12:04, 5 p.m., he significantly says that all is in quiet towards the Blue Ridge, and that only a few cavalry vedettes were seen about Middleburg, and none on the Snickersville pike. If his flank and rear had been harassed, all would not have been too quiet. Again, General Robertson was directed to keep his command on the right of the army and in contact with the enemy when they left, in order that he might keep the commanding general informed of their movements. 22. 5 p.m., June 26. Major General Butterfield, headquarters, AP, have just arrived. One division is covering the flank from Aldie to this place by way of Mount Gilead. 3 brigades of 2nd Division are covering the 3 roads from Aldie and Gum Springs until all quiet towards the Blue Ridge. Very few cavalry pickets seen near Middleburg this morning. None in the Snickers Gap pike. A Pleasanton and Major General, but when General Lee had sent an order for him to come on and join the army, as there could be no reason for his remaining any longer in Virginia after the enemy had left, he actually followed on the left and crossed the Potomac at Williamsport. General Lee's right-hand flank was thus left exposed to the enemy's cavalry, but fortunately they had nearly all been sent in search of Stuart. If the pressure of the column of 3,000 cavalry with 2 batteries under Robertson had been brought to bear on the flank of the Union Army, its advance into Pennsylvania would have been less rapid, and Meade could not have spared 2/3 of his cavalry to send after Stuart to embarrass his march. If the force of cavalry which Stuart left behind him had promptly moved in obedience to his orders on the 26th to place itself in its proper position on the right of the army, then it could easily have occupied Gettysburg in advance of the enemy. It did nothing of the kind, but quietly rested 3 days at Ashby's Gap to learn through General Lee where the enemy had gone. The professed historians of the war make no mention of these facts. Stuart is dead, for 1 hour of Dundee. Headquarters, June 22, 1863. Major General J.E.B. Stuart, commanding cavalry. General, I have just received your note of 7.45 this morning to General Longstreet. I judge the efforts of the enemy yesterday were to arrest our progress and ascertain our whereabouts. Perhaps he is satisfied. Do you know where he is and what he is doing? I fear he will steal a march on us and get across the Potomac before we are aware. If you find that he is moving northward, and that 2 brigades can guard the Blue Ridge and take care of your rear, you can move with the other 3 into Maryland and take position on General Ewell. Is right. Place yourself in communication with him, guard his flank and keep him informed of the enemy's movements, and collect all the supplies you can for the use of the army. 1 column of General Ewell's army will probably move towards the Susquehanna by the Emmitsburg route, another by Chambersburg. Accounts from him last night state that there was no enemy west of Fredericktown. A cavalry force, about 100, guarded the Monocacy Bridge, which was barricaded. You will, of course, take charge of Jenkins's brigade and give him necessary instructions. All supplies taken in Maryland must be by authorized staff officers, for their respective departments, by no one else. They will be paid for or receipts for the same given to the owners. I will send you a general order on this subject, which I wish you to see is strictly complied with. I am, very respectfully, your obedient servant, R.E. Lee, General. Headquarters, Millwood, June 22, 1863, 7 p.m. Major, General J.E.B. Stuart, Combahee Cavalry. General Lee has enclosed to me this letter for you, to be forwarded to you, provided you can be spared from my front, and provided I think that you can move across the Potomac without disclosing our plans. He speaks of your leaving via Hopewell Gap and passing by the rear of the enemy. If you can get through by that route, I think that you will be less likely to indicate what our plans are than if you should cross by passing to our rear. I forward the letter of instructions with these suggestions. Please advise me of the condition of affairs before you leave, and order General Hampton, whom I suppose you will leave here, in command, to report to me at Millwood either by letter or in person, as may be most agreeable to him. Most respectfully, J. Longstreet, General. N.B. I think that your passage of the Potomac by our rear at the present moment will, in a measure, disclose our plans. You had better not leave us, therefore, unless you can take the proposed route in rear of the enemy. J. Longstreet, 1lt, Gen L. Headquarters, Army of North Virginia, June 23, 1863, 5 p.m. Major General J.E.B. Stuart, Commanding Cavalry. General, your notes of 9 and 10:30 a.m. today have just been received. As regards the purchase of tobacco for your men, supposing that Confederate money not be taken, I am willing for your commissaries or quartermasters to purchase this tobacco and let the men get it from them, but I can have nothing seized by the men. If General Hooker's army remains inactive, you can leave 2 brigades to watch him and withdraw with the 3 others, but should he not appear to be moving northward, I think you had better withdraw this side of the mountain tomorrow night, cross at Shepherdstown next day, and move over to Fredericktown. You will, however, be able to judge whether you can pass around their army without hindrance, doing them all the damage you can, and cross the river east of the mountains. In either case, after crossing the river, you must move on and feel the right of Ewell's troops, collecting information, provisions, etc. Give instructions to the commander of the brigades left behind to watch the flank and rear of the army and, in event of the enemy leaving their front, retire. From the mountains west of the Shenandoah, leaving sufficient pickets to guard the passes and bringing everything clean along the valley, closing upon the rear of the army. As regards the movements of the 2 brigades of the enemy moving towards Warrenton, the commander of the brigades to be left in the mountains must do what he can to counteract them, but I think the sooner you cross into Maryland after tomorrow, the better. The movements of Ewell's corps are as stated in my former letter. Hill's 1st Division will reach the Potomac today, and Longstreet will follow tomorrow. Be watchful and circumspect in all your movements. I am, very respectfully and truly yours, R. E. Lee, 10 General, H.D. QRS, Cavi Div, Army of Enva, June 24, 1863. Brig General B. H. Robertson, Tom D.G. Cavalry. General, your own and General Jones's brigades will cover the front of Ashby's and Snicker's Gaps, yourself as senior officer being in command. Your object will be to watch the enemy, deceive him as to our designs, and harass his rear if you find he is retiring. Be always on the alert, let nothing escape your observation, and miss no opportunity which offers to damage the enemy. After the enemy has moved beyond your reach, leave sufficient pickets in the mountains, and withdraw to the west side of the Shenandoah, and place a strong and reliable picket to watch the enemy at Harper's Ferry, cross the Potomac and follow the army, keeping on its right and rear, as long as the enemy remains in your front in force, unless otherwise ordered by General R. E. Lee, Lieutenant General. Longstreet or myself hold the gaps with a line of pickets reaching across the Shenandoah by Charlestown to the Potomac. If, in the contingency mentioned, you withdraw, sweep the valley clear of what pertains to the army, and cross the Potomac at the different points crossed by it, you will instruct General Jones from time to time as the movement's progress or events may require, and report anything of importance to Lieutenant General Longstreet, with whose position you will communicate by relays through Charlestown. I send instructions for General Jones, which please read. Avail yourself of every means in your power to increase the efficiency of your command and keep it up to the highest number possible. Particular attention will be paid to shoeing horses and to marching off of the turnpikes. In case of an advance of the enemy, you will offer such resistance as will be justifiable to check him and discover his intentions, and, if possible, you will prevent him from gaining possession of the gaps. In case of a move by the enemy upon Warrenton, you will counteract it as much as you can compatible with previous instructions. You will have, with the 2 brigades, 2 batteries of horse artillery. Very respectfully, your OBL. Served, J.E.B. Stuart, to Major General Combe G. Do not change your present line of pickets until daylight tomorrow morning unless compelled to do so. Chapter 14th. Soon after the outbreak of war in the spring of 1861, the 1st Regiment of Virginia Cavalry was organized with J.E.B. Stuart as colonel. He was then just 28 years of age, a native of Virginia and a graduate of West Point. As lieutenant of cavalry, he had had some experience in Indian warfare in the West, in which he had been wounded, and in the raid of John Brown on the United States Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, had acted as aide to Colonel, afterwards General Robert E. Lee. The 1st Virginia Cavalry was attached to the command of General Joseph E. Johnston in the Shenandoah Valley and assigned to the duty of watching Patterson, who had crossed the Potomac and was threatening the Southern Army. Then at Winchester, I was a private in a company of cavalry called the Washington Mounted Rifles, which was commanded by Captain William E. Jones, an officer who some years before had retired from the United States Army and gave the company the name of his old regiment. Jones was a graduate of West Point and had been a comrade of Stonewall Jackson's while there. He has often entertained me in his tent at night with anecdotes of that eccentric genius. No man in the South was better qualified to mold the wild element he controlled into soldiers. His authority was exercised mildly but firmly, and to the lessons of duty and obedience he taught me. I acknowledge that I am largely indebted for whatever success I may afterwards have had as a commander. I first saw Stuart in the month of July, 1861, at a village called Bunker Hill on the pike leading from Winchester to Martinsburg, where Patterson was camped. His regiment was stationed there to observe the movements of the Union Army. His personal appearance bore the stamp of his military character, the fire, the dash, the energy and physical endurance that seemed able to defy all natural laws. Simultaneously with the movement of McDowell against Beauregard began Patterson's demonstration to keep Johnston at Winchester. It was, however, too feeble to have any effect except to neutralize his own forces. The plan of the Southern generals was to avoid a battle in the valley and concentrate their armies at Manassas. The duty was assigned to Stuart's cavalry of masking the march of Johnston to Manassas, and at the same time watching Patterson. General Scott had ordered him to feel the enemy strongly and not to allow him to escape to Manassas to reinforce Beauregard. Patterson replied in the most confident tone that he was holding Johnston. After the battle had been won by the Confederates, in reply to Scott's criticism upon him for not having engaged them, Patterson comforted him with the assurance that if he had done so, Scott would have had to mourn the defeat of 2 armies instead of 1. The records show that at that time Patterson had about 18,000 men, and Johnston about 10,000. On the 15th of July, Patterson advanced and drove us with artillery from our camp at Bunker Hill. Stuart had none to reply with. All of us thought a battle at Winchester was imminent. Patterson had 1 regiment of the regular besides some volunteer cavalry from Philadelphia, but made no use of them. He never sent his cavalry outside his infantry lines, and their only service was to add to the pomp and circumstance of war on reviews and parades. He stayed 1 day at Bunker Hill, and then, thinking he had done enough in driving us away, turned off squarely to the left and marched down to Charlestown. He had not been in 12 miles of our army, and this was the way he executed General Scott's order to feel it strongly. Stuart still hung so close on his flanks that he occasionally let a shell drop among us. As soon as the movement to Charlestown was developed, Johnston received intelligence of it through Stuart. He saw then that Patterson did not intend an attack, and got ready to join Beauregard. The Union general went into camp at Charlestown while the Confederate folded his tent like the Arab and quietly stole away. Stuart spread a curtain of cavalry between the opposing armies which so effectually concealed the movement of Johnston that Patterson never suspected it until it had been accomplished. The telegraphic correspondence at that time between General Scott and Patterson now reads like an extract from the transactions of the Pickwick Club. On July 13th, Scott telegraphs to Patterson, "Make demonstrations to detain Johnston in the valley." July 14th, Patterson replies, "Will advance tomorrow. Unless I can rout, shall be careful not to set him in full retreat toward Strasburg." He seemed to be afraid of frightening Johnston so much that he would run away. Again, Scott telegraphs to Patterson, "Do not let the enemy amuse and delay you with a small force in front, whilst he reinforces the junction with his main body." This shows that General Scott, who was in Washington, had the sagacity to discern what we were likely to do. On July 18th, General Scott says to him, "I have been certainly expecting you to beat the enemy, if not to hear that you had felt him strongly, or at least had occupied him by threats and demonstrations." At that time Patterson was 20 miles distant from Johnston and never got any closer. This was all the feeling he did. On the same day Patterson replies, "The enemy has stolen no march on me. I have kept him actively employed, and by threats and reconnaissances in force caused him to be reinforced." At that time Johnston was marching to Manassas, and Stuart's cavalry were watching the smoke as it curled from the Union camps at Charlestown. Again, on July 18th, in order to make General Scott feel perfectly secure, Patterson tells him, "I have succeeded, in accordance with the wishes of the General-in-Chief, in keeping Johnston's force at Winchester. A reconnaissance in force on Tuesday caused him to be largely reinforced from Strasbourg, and on July 21st, when the junction of the two armies had been effected and the great battle was raging at Manassas, he telegraphs to Scott, "Johnston left Millwood yesterday to operate on McDowell's right and to turn through Loudon on me," as Patterson was haunted by the idea that Johnston was after him. Although he had marched in an opposite direction, he concluded to retreat to Harper's Ferry. The success of Johnston's strategy in eluding Patterson and cheating him into the belief that he was still in the valley is due to the vigilance of Stuart and his activity and skill in the management of cavalry. The Northern general never discovered how badly he had been fooled until the day of the battle, when he was too far away to give any assistance. But Stuart was not satisfied with the work he had done. After the infantry had been transferred to the railroad east of the Blue Ridge, he left a single company as a veil in front of Patterson and joined the army at Manassas on the evening before the battle. We had been almost continuously in the saddle for a week, and I have a vivid remembrance of the faces of the men, bronzed with sun and dust from the long march. The two armies were in such close contact that all knew there would be a battle on the morrow. Patterson was safe in the valley. When he was before the Committee on the Conduct of the War to give his reasons for not advancing on Johnston at Winchester, he filed a paper containing the following statement: "Among the regiments there was one of Kentucky riflemen, armed with heavy bowie knives. They refused to take more than one round of cartridges. They proposed to place themselves in the bushes for assault. Of course, no prudent commander would lead men where they would be disemboweled by an enemy hidden in the bushes. Perhaps General Patterson was imitating the example of Othello and trying to captivate congressmen, as the Moor did the ear of Desdemona with tales of the cannibals that do each other eat, the anthropophagi, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. On the night before the battle, the raw troops were excited by every noise, and the picket firing was incessant. We slept soundly in our bivouac in the pines, and early in the morning were awakened by the revel that called us to arms. As the sun rose, the rattle of musketry began along Bull Run, and soon from one end of the line to the other there was a continuous roar of small arms and artillery. War loses a great deal of its romance after a soldier has seen his first battle. I have a more vivid recollection of the first than the last one I was in. It is a classical maxim that it is sweet and becoming to die for one's country, but whoever has seen the horrors of a battlefield feels that it is far sweeter to live for it. The Confederate generals had expected a battle on our right. As a fact, our left wing was turned, and the battle was mostly fought by Johnston's troops, who, having come up the day before, had been held in reserve. Stuart's regiment, having just arrived, had not been sent on the outposts, and hence is in no way responsible for the surprise. In the crisis of the battle, when Jackson with his brigade was standing like a stone wall against the advancing host, he called for Stuart's cavalry to support him. Stuart sent one squadron to Jackson's right, under the major, who did nothing. I was with him, while with 6 companies he came up on Jackson's left, just in time to charge and rout the Ellsworth Zouaves. Their general, in his report, says that he was never able to rally them during the fight. This cavalry charge had an important effect upon the fortunes of the day, as it delayed the enemy, and gave time for troops to come to the relief of Jackson, who was then hard-pressed by superior numbers. Stuart afterward, with a battery of artillery, led the turning movement that caused the rout, and associated the stream of Bull Run with the most memorable panic in history. Shortly after the battle, all the cavalry of the army was organized into a brigade, with Stuart in command. Jones was also promoted to be colonel of the regiment, and Fitz Lee became lieutenant colonel. From this time until the army evacuated Manassas, in the spring of 1862, the cavalry was almost exclusively engaged in outpost duty. McClellan kept close to the fortifications around Washington while he was organizing the Army of the Potomac, and his cavalry rarely ventured beyond his infantry pickets. No field was open for brilliant exploits, but the discipline and experience of a life on the outpost soon converted the Confederate volunteers into veterans. Without intending any disparagement, I may say that the habits and education of Northern men had not been such as to adapt them readily to the cavalry service, without a process of drilling, while, on the contrary, the Southern youth who, like the ancient Persians, had been taught from his cradle to ride, to shoot, and speak the truth, leaped into his saddle, almost a cavalryman from his birth. The Cossacks, who came from their native wilds on the Don to break the power of Napoleon, had no other training in war than the habits of nomadic life, and in the same school were bred the Parthian horsemen who drove to despair the legions of Crassus and Antony. I must also say that the Confederate authorities made but slight use of the advantage they enjoyed in the early periods of the war for creating a fine body of cavalry, and that little wisdom was shown in the use of what they did have. It would have been far better military policy during the first winter of the war to have saved the cavalry as McClellan did, either to lead the advance or cover the retreat in the spring campaign. It was largely consumed in work which the infantry might have done without imposing much additional hardships on them, as the proportion of cavalry was so small. When the Southern Army retired, in March 1862, 3/4 of the horses had been broken down by the hard work of the winter, and the men had been furloughed to go home for fresh ones. The Confederate government did not furnish horses for the cavalry, but paid the men 40 cents a day for the use of them. This vicious policy was the source of continual depletion of the cavalry. Stuart's old regiment, the 1st Virginia Cavalry, of which I was adjutant with at least 800 men on its muster rolls, did not have 150 for duty on the morning we broke up winter quarters on Bull Run. If the cavalry brigade had been cantoned on the border, in the rich counties of Fauquier and Loudoun, the ranks would have been full and their granaries would not have been left as forage for the enemy. The Confederate Army fell back leisurely from the front of Washington and rested some weeks on the Rappahannock, waiting the development of McClellan's plans. Stuart's cavalry was the rear guard. Sumner pushed forward with a division along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad to make a demonstration and cover McClellan's operations in another direction. He rather overdid the thing. On reaching our picket line on Cedar Run, he made a grand display by deploying his whole force in an open field. I happened to be on the picket line that day and told Colonel Jones that it was only a feint to deceive us. We retired, and the enemy occupied our camping ground that night. The next morning Stuart was at Bayleton Station, and our skirmishers were engaged with the enemy, who was advancing towards the Rappahannock. My own regiment had just taken position on the railroad when I rode up to Stuart, with whom I had become pretty well acquainted. Since we had left the line of Bull Run, I had several times returned on scouts for him. He said to me, "I want to find out whether this is McClellan's army or only a feint." I replied, "I will go and find out for you." I immediately started towards the rear of the enemy's column with 2 or 3 men, and reached a point some distance behind it about the time they were shelling our cavalry they had driven over the river. I saw that the enemy was only making a demonstration and rode nearly all night to get back to Stuart. When I got to the river, we came very near being shot by our own pickets, who mistook us for the enemy. I found Stuart with General Ewell anxiously waiting to hear from me or for the enemy to cross the river. I have not been so fortunate as to have a poet to do for me on this occasion what Longfellow did for the midnight ride of Paul Revere. There was a drizzling rain and a dense fog. It was impossible to see what the enemy were doing. I remember Stuart's joy and surprise when I told him that they were falling back from the river. In the rapture of the moment, he told me that I could get any reward I wanted for what I had done. The only reward I asked was the opportunity to do the same thing again. In 10 minutes the cavalry had crossed the river and was capturing prisoners. Nothing had been left before us but a screen of cavalry, which was quickly brushed away. It now became evident that McClellan would move down the Potomac and operate against Richmond from a new base and on another line. This was the first cavalry reconnaissance that had ever been made to the rear of the enemy, and was considered as something remarkable at that time. At a later period they were very common. Soon after this, Stuart's cavalry was transferred from the line of the Rappahannock with the rest of Johnston's army to confront McClellan on the peninsula. I dined with General Lee at his headquarters near Petersburg about 6 weeks before the surrender. He told me then that he had been opposed to General Johnston's withdrawing to the peninsula, and had written to him while he was on the Rapidan, advising him to move back towards the Potomac. He thought that if he had done this, McClellan would have been recalled to the defense of Washington. He further said that instead of falling back from Yorktown to Richmond, General Johnston should have made a stand with his whole army, instead of a part of it, on the narrow isthmus at Williamsburg. 23. See Stuart's report to General Johnston. Just before we reached Williamsburg, news came of the passage of the conscription law, which preserved all the regimental organizations as they were. The men were held in the ranks but allowed to elect their company officers, and these in turn elected field officers. It is hard to reconcile democracy with military principles, and consequently many of the best officers were dropped. Such was the fate of my colonel. The staff officers, not being elected, were supposed to hold over without reappointment. I immediately handed my resignation as adjutant to the new colonel, Fitz-Lee, who accepted it. The conscription law at first produced some dissatisfaction among the men, as most of them had served 12 months without a furlough, but this soon subsided. All acquiesced in what was regarded as imperious necessity. The loss of our positions in the 1st Virginia Cavalry resulted in a benefit both to Jones and myself. Through the influence of Stonewall Jackson, Jones was made a brigadier general, and soon after the death of Ashby was given the command of his brigade. Stuart invited me to come to his headquarters and act as a scout for him. In this way I began my career as a partisan, which now, when I recall it through the mist of years, seems as unreal as the lives of the paladins. I wish it to be understood that a scout is not a spy who goes in disguise, but a soldier in arms and uniform who reconnoiters either inside or outside an enemy's line. Such a life is full of adventure, excitement, and romance. Stuart was not only an educated but a heaven-born soldier, whose natural genius had not been stifled by red tape and the narrow rules of the schools. The history of the war furnishes no better type of the American soldier. As a chief of cavalry he is without a peer. He cared little for formulas, and knew when to follow and when to disregard precedents. He was the first to see that the European methods of employing cavalry were not adapted to the conditions of modern war. 24, his inventive genius discovered new ways of making cavalry useful that had never been dreamed of by the regular professors of the science. I will now give some illustrations of his originality and the fertility of his resources. When McClellan was lying in the swamps of the Chickahominy, the infantry lines of the two armies were so close together that cavalry operations in their front were impracticable. One morning, when Stuart's headquarters were near Richmond, he invited me to breakfast with him, and at the table asked me to take 2 or 3 men and find out whether McClellan was fortifying on the Totopotomoy Creek. I had been inactive for some time, and this was just the opportunity I wanted. I started, but was diverted from the route I had been directed to go by, there being a flag of truce on the road. I did not want to return without accomplishing something, so I turned north and made a wide detour by Hanover Courthouse. Although I was then engaged in the business of breaking idols, I had not lost all reverence for antiquity. I stopped a while to muse in the old brick building where Patrick Henry made his first speech at the bar, and pleaded the cause of the people against the parsons. In order to understand the enterprise on which I was going, a geographical description of the country and situation of the armies is necessary. The Battle of Fair Oaks or Seven Pines had been fought, and the Army of the Potomac was lying on the peninsula between the James and Pamunkey rivers, and a straddle of the Chickahominy, which meanders between them and finally empties into the James. McClellan's right wing rested on the Pamunkey, with his base at the White House and his line of supply by the York River Railroad. His left extended to within a few miles of the James. The Totopotomoy Creek flows into the Pamunkey. I got down in the enemy's lines on the Totopotomoy and ascertained that 6 or 8 miles of McClellan's front was a mere shroud of cavalry pickets that covered his line of communication with his depot at the White House. Of course, as he had no infantry on his right, there would be no fortifications there. The idea immediately occurred to me that here was a grand opportunity for Stuart to strike a blow. It is now clear why General Lee wanted to get information about the enemy's fortifying the Totopotomoy. 24. That infantry armed with repeating rifles and fixed ammunition would have destroyed the squadrons of Murad at Ailu and Mount Tabor before they ever got close enough to use their sabers. About 3 weeks after that he called Jackson from the valley, who struck McClellan on this very ground. I was chased away from there and came out just behind a regiment of Union cavalry going on a scout. They very little thought that I was coming back so soon. I hastened to Stuart's headquarters to give him the information. Everybody there was in high glee. News had just come of Jackson's victories over Fremont and Shields, Cross Keys, and Port Republic had been inscribed on his banners. It was a hot day in June, and Stuart was sitting under the shade of a tree, and I lay down on the grass to tell him what I had learned. After giving him the information, I remarked that, as the cavalry was idle, he could find on the Pamunkey something for them to do. A blow on this weak point would greatly alarm McClellan for the safety of his supplies, and compel him to detach heavily from his front to guard them. After I got through, he said to me, "Write down what you have told me." I went to his adjutant's office and wrote it down hurriedly, but, not attaching much importance to it, did not sign the writing. When I brought the paper to Stuart, he had his horse ready to mount. He called my attention to the omission, and I went back and signed it. He started off at a gallop with a single courier to General Lee's headquarters. He returned that afternoon, and orders were immediately issued for a part of the cavalry to get ready to march. General Lee's instructions to Stuart directing, or rather authorizing, the expedition are dated June 11th, which shows how soon he started after my return, which was on the 10th, 25 with about 1,200 cavalry and 2 pieces of artillery. On the morning of June 12, Stuart left Richmond, moving in a northerly direction to create the impression that he was going to reinforce Jackson. That night we bivouacked within a few miles of Hanover Courthouse. During his absence, his adjutant was left in charge of his headquarters. I was present when he started. The adjutant asked him how long he would be gone. Stuart's answer was, "It may be for years, and it may be forever." Taking leave of his staff had suggested the parting from Aaron and Kathleen Mavourneen. 25 von Borka, a Prussian on Stuart's staff, in his memoirs, says that he and Stuart rode alone at night 5 miles inside the enemy's lines on the Chickahominy to the house of an Irishman, which Stuart had appointed as a rendezvous to meet a spy. The spy not appearing, he says that he and Stuart waited for him till daylight and then rode to his house, just as the revel sounded in the Yankee camps, only 400 paces distant. Such rides, he says, were habitual with Stuart, and of course von Borka always went with him. He adds, "The object of this excursion soon appeared. Our cavalry force received orders to provide themselves with rations for 3 days, and on the 12th we commenced that ride round the army of McClellan which attracted so much attention even in Europe. The Baron Munchausen, who was a countryman of von Borka's, never invented a purer fiction. Tradition says that King Alfred went, disguised as a harper, into the court of the Danes. He was, however, acting as a spy, and did not go to meet one. There is not a soldier of the Army of Northern Virginia who does not know that neither Stuart nor any other Confederate general ever did such a thing. Stuart employed scouts and spies to get information for him, but they reported to him at his headquarters. He never went either inside or outside the enemy's lines to meet them. There were many surmises as to his destination, but I never doubted for a moment where we were going. Early the next morning, Stuart sent me on in advance with a few men to Hanover Courthouse, and I then saw that my idea of a raid on McClellan's lines was about to be realized. When we got within a few hundred yards of the village, a squadron of cavalry was discovered there, and I sent a man back to inform Stuart of it, so that he might send a regiment round to cut off their retreat. He ordered the 1st Virginia Cavalry to go, but the enemy, suspecting that there was a stronger force than they could see, withdrew too soon to be caught. The column then pushed rapidly towards the camp of Union cavalry at Old Church. At that place, Captain Royal was stationed with 2 squadrons of the 5th U.S. Regular Cavalry. There was a running fight of several miles with the pickets, and finally we met Captain Royal, who came out with his whole command to reinforce the outpost. He had no suspicion of the number he was attacking, and as soon as he came in sight, Stuart ordered the front squadron of the 9th Virginia Cavalry to charge. Royal was wounded and routed. On our side, Captain Latane was killed. We could not stay to give him even the hasty burial that the hero received who died on the ramparts of Corunna. This was left for female hands to do. The scene has been preserved on canvas by a Virginia artist. As Royal's command had been scattered, we soon had possession of his camp, and were feasting on the good things we found in it. Nearly everybody forgot, many never knew, the danger we were in. A mile or so on our left was an impassable river. Not more than 6 miles to the right were McClellan's headquarters, with Fitz John Porter's corps and the reserve division of cavalry camped near us. Here was the turning point of the expedition. Stuart was as jolly as anybody, but his head was always level in critical moments. Even in the midst of fun, there was a short conference between him and the Lees, who were the colonels of the 2 Virginia regiments. I was sitting on my horse, buckling on a pistol I had just captured, within a few feet of them, and heard all that passed. Stuart was for pushing on to the York River Railroad, which was still 9 miles off. Lee, of the 9th son of General R.E. Lee, was in favor of it, but Fitz Lee was opposed. Stuart had no idea of turning back, and determined to go on and strike McClellan in his rear. In the conception and execution of this bold enterprise, he showed the genius and the intrepid spirit that took the plunge of the Rubicon. Just as he gave the command, "Forward!" he turned to me and said, "Mosby, I want you to ride some distance ahead." I replied, "Very well. But you must give me a guide. I don't know the road." He then ordered 2 cavalrymen who were familiar with the country to go with me, and I started on towards Tunstall's station. I was on a slow horse, and I remember that I had not gone very far before Stuart sent one of his staff to tell me to go faster and increase the distance between us. It was important that we should reach the railroad before dark, or reinforcements could be sent there. So I went on with my 2 men at a trot. 26. Stuart's report contained recommendations of a number who had been with him for promotion. He said, Captains W.D. Farley and J.S. Mosby, without commission, have established a claim for position which a grateful country will not, I trust, disregard. Their distinguished services run far back towards the beginning of the war, and present a shining record of daring and usefulness. Stuart's biographer, without so intending, has made a statement which, if true, would rob him of all the glory of the enterprise. He says that after reaching Old Church, Stuart kept on because it was safer than to go back by the route he had come. The road to Hanover Courthouse was open, and it would not have been possible for the enemy to have closed it against him for several hours. The fight with Royall was near his camp, and did not last 5 minutes. It took only a few minutes to destroy it. If he had intended to return by Hanover, he would have left pickets behind him to keep the way open. But he did nothing of the kind. He took no more account of his rear than Cortez did when he burned his ships and marched to the capital of the Aztec kings. The route of the 2 squadrons of cavalry was in itself an insignificant result as compared with the magnitude of the preparation. At this point he had simply broken through McClellan's picket line, but had not gained his rear. To have returned after doing this and no more would have been very much like the labor of a mountain and the birth of a mouse. The fight and capture of Royall's camp at Old Church occurred about 2:00 p.m. on June 13th. The nearest camps were 3 or 4 miles off. Major Williams reports that he came on the ground with 380 of the 6th Cavalry at 3:30 p.m., about 1 hour after the rear of Stuart's cavalry had passed on towards Tunstall's. This 1 hour would of itself have been amply sufficient to allow Stuart's return unmolested before the arrival of that force. It will hardly be contended that 380 men of any cavalry the world ever saw could have stopped Stuart with 1,200 men and 2 pieces of artillery. The 5th U.S. Cavalry came on the ground about 5 o'clock, and General Cooke, who was Stuart's father-in-law with the rest of his cavalry division, Warren's brigade of infantry, and a battery of artillery, reached there after dark. It is very difficult, therefore, to see what there was to prevent Stuart from returning if he had so desired. In all, there were 2 brigades of cavalry, 1 of infantry, and a battery of artillery sent in pursuit of him. General Emory, who led the advance, says that he followed on Stuart's track and reached Tunstall's at 2 o'clock that night, where he found General Reynolds, who had come up with a brigade of infantry on the cars about 12 o'clock. Reynolds says that our rear guard had left there about 2 hours before he arrived. At Tunstall's, General Emory says he lost Stuart's trail and set every squadron he had to hunting for it, and did not succeed in finding it until 8 o'clock the next morning, as Stuart had left Tunstall's on the plain country road on which he had been marching all day, and on which General Emory had followed him. It seems strange that 1,200 cavalry, with 2 pieces of artillery, should have left no track behind them. General Warren says that the moon was shining brightly, making any kind of movement for ourselves or the enemy as easy as in daylight. General Cooke, with the rest of the cavalry and infantry and artillery, arrived about 9 o'clock the next morning. General Emory then moved forward in pursuit with infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Warren says, "'It was impossible for the infantry to overtake him, Stuart, and as the cavalry did not move without us, it was impossible for them to overtake him." And Fitzjohn Porter regrets, and that when General Cooke did pursue, he should have tied his legs with the infantry command. Perhaps General Cooke was acting on the maxim that recommends us to build a bridge of gold for a retreating foe, but then it can hardly be said that Stuart was retreating, as there were 6 cavalry regiments, including all the regulars, on our track with a battery of artillery. It is hard to see the use they had for infantry, except as a brake to keep them from going too fast. The pursuit was from beginning to end a comedy of errors. The infantry could not have expected to overtake us, whereas, if we had attempted to return by the same route we came, then they might have intercepted us by remaining where they were. Stuart was reduced to the alternative of returning home by the road along the Pamunkey or the one up James River. If he took the latter, then a slight extension of McClellan's left flank would have barred his way. It could hardly have been imagined that we were going down to capture Fort Monroe, or that Stuart's cavalry were amphibious animals that could cross the York and James Rivers without pontoons. Only the cavalry on McClellan's right was in the pursuit. He had an abundance on his left to block our way, and they had 24 hours' notice of our coming. Now to return to my narrative of Stuart's march. As I was jogging along with my two companions a mile or two ahead of the column, I came upon a well-filled sutler's wagon at a crossroads, of which I took possession by right of discovery. At the same time, about a mile off to my left, I could see the masts of several vessels riding at anchor in the river. I sent one of the men back to tell Stuart to hurry on. The sutler was too rich a prize to abandon, so I left the other man in charge of him and his wagon and hurried on. Just as I turned a bend of the road, I came plump upon another sutler, and a cavalry vidette was by him. They were so shocked by the apparition that they surrendered as quietly as the coon did to Captain Scott. Tunstall Station was now in full view half a mile off. I was all alone. Just then a bugle sounded. I saw about a squadron of cavalry drawn up in line near the railroad. I knew that the head of our column must be close by, and my horse was too tired to run, so I just drew my saber and waved it in the air. They knew from this that support was near me. In a few seconds our advance guard under Lieutenant Robbins appeared in sight, and the squadron in front of me vanished from view. Robbins captured the depot with the guard without firing a shot. Stuart soon rode up. Just then, a train of cars came in sight, and as we had no implements with which to pull up a rail, a number of logs were put on the track. When the engineer got near us, he saw that he was in a hornet's nest, and with a full head of steam dashed on under a heavy fire, knocked the logs off the track and carried the news to the White House below. General Ingalls, who was in command of the depot there, says that he had received a telegram from General McClellan's headquarters, telling him of the attack on Royall's camp and warning him of danger. As soon then as the telegraph line was broken, which was about sunset on the 13th, it was noticed to McClellan that we were in his rear and on his line of communication. 27, 11th Pennsylvania. There was now but one route by which we could return, and that was up James River. Yet he made no signs of a movement to prevent it, and the only evidence that he knew of our presence is a telegram to Stanton on the next day, dated 11 a.m., June 14th, saying that a body of cavalry had passed around his right, and that he had sent cavalry in pursuit to punish them. Before reaching Tunstall's, Stuart sent a squadron to burn the transports in the river and a wagon train that was loading from them. The small guard fled at the approach of our cavalry, while the schooners and wagons disappeared in smoke. As some evidence of the consternation produced by this sudden eruption, I will mention the fact that after we left Old Church, a sergeant with 25 men of the United States regular cavalry followed on under a flag of truce and surrendered to our rear guard. They supposed they were cut off and surrounded. The Jeff Davis Legion was the rear guard, and these were the only enemies they saw. The dispatch to Stanton shows the bewildered state of McClellan's mind. At the time he was writing it, we were lying on the banks of the Chickahominy, building a bridge to cross on. To have caught us, it was not necessary to pursue at all. All that he had to do was to spread his wings. We halted at Tunstall's long enough for the column to close up. Our march was slow. The artillery horses had broken down, and we were encumbered with a large number of prisoners on foot, and of course we could march no faster than they did. After dark the column moved down through New Kent towards the Chickahominy. On the road were large encampments of army wagons. Many a sutler was ruined that night. With sad hearts they fell into line with the prisoners and saw their wagons with their contents vanish in flames. The heavens were lurid with the light reflected from the burning trains, and our track was as brilliant as the tail of a comet. The Count of Paris, who was on McClellan's staff, thus described Stuart's march. But night had come, and the fires kindled by his hand flashing above the forest were so many signals which drew the Federals on his track. Now, the Count of Paris evidently means that the glowing sky ought to have been a guide to the Federal generals as the pillar of fire was to Moses. As a fact, the only pursuers we saw were those who came after us to surrender under a flag of truce. Stuart halted 3 hours at Baltimore Store, only 5 miles from Tunstall's. At 12 o'clock he started again for a ford of the Chickahominy, which was 8 miles distant, and reached it about daylight. That summer night was a carnival of fun I can never forget. Nobody thought of danger or of sleep, when champagne bottles were bursting and Rhine wine was flowing in copious streams. All had perfect confidence in their leader. In the riot among the sutlers' stores, grim-visaged war had smoothed his wrinkled front, and Mars resigned his scepter to the jolly god. The discipline of soldiers for a while gave way to the wild revelry of the crew of Comus. During all of this time, General Emory was a few miles off, at Tunstall Station, hunting our tracks in the sand with a lighted candle. Stuart had expected to ford the Chickahominy, but when we got there, it was found overflowing from the recent rains, and impassable. Up to this point our progress had been as easy as the descent to Avernus, but now, to get over the river, intic labor, incent inc opus est. He was fortunate in having two guides, Christian and Fraser, who lived in the neighborhood, and knew all the roads and fords on the river. Christian knew of a bridge, or rather where a bridge had been, about a mile below the ford, and the column was immediately headed for it. But it had been destroyed, and nothing was left but some of the piles standing in the water. He was again fortunate in having two men, Burke and Hagan, who knew something about bridge building. Nearby were the remains of an old warehouse, out of which they built a bridge. It was marvelous with what rapidity the structure grew. In a few hours it was finished. It seemed almost by magic. It was not as good a bridge as Caesar threw over the Rhine, but it was good enough for our purpose. While the men were at work upon it, Stuart was lying down on the bank of the stream, in the gayest humor I ever saw him, laughing at the prank he had played on McClellan. As I was a believer in the Napoleonic maxim of making war support war, I had foraged extensively during the night, and from the sutler's stores spread a feast that Epicurus might have envied. During all the long hours that we lay on the bank of the river waiting for the bridge, no enemy appeared in sight. That was a mystery nobody could understand. There was some apprehension that McClellan was allowing us to cross over in order to entrap us in the forks of the Chickahominy. When at last, about 2 o'clock, the cavalry, artillery, prisoners, and captured horses and mules were all over, and fire had been set to the bridge, some of Rush's lancers came on a hill and took a farewell look at us. They came and saw and went away, taking as their only trophy a drunken Dutchman we had left on the road. General Emory received news of the crossing 8 miles off at Baltimore Store. Our escape over the river was immediately reported to him. In his official report he says that we crossed the Chickahominy at daylight, and that we left faster than we came. Now, I am unable to see the evidence of any particular haste in the march. In fact, it seems to have been conducted very leisurely. About 1 o'clock p.m. on the 13th, we captured Royal's camp at Old Church. About sunset we reached Tunstall's, 9 miles distant, and at daylight on the 14th got to a point on the Chickahominy 12 miles from there, where we stayed until noon. So if we had been pursued at the rate of a mile an hour, we would have been overtaken. But the danger was not over when we were over the Chickahominy. We were still 35 miles from Richmond, and in the rear of McClellan's army, which was 5 or 6 miles above us. It was necessary to pass through swamps, where the horses sunk to their saddle girths, and when we emerged from these we had to go for 20 miles on A road in full view of the enemy's gunboats on one side of us in the James River, and McClellan's army within a few miles on the other. Nothing would have been easier than for him to have thrown a division of infantry as well as cavalry across our path. Then nothing could have saved us except such a miracle as destroyed Pharaoh and his host. Stuart, apprehending a movement on McClellan's left, had sent a messenger early in the morning to General Lee requesting him to make a diversion in his favor. But we were out of danger before he had time to do it. After getting through the swamp, the command halted in Charles City for several hours to give rest to the men and horses. Stuart then turned over the command to Fitz Lee, as we were then in comparative safety, and with 2 men rode on to General Lee's headquarters, which he reached about daybreak the next morning. During the night march, I was in advance of the column, but saw nothing in the path except occasionally a Negro who would dart across it going into the Union lines. Early in the morning, just as I got in sight of Richmond, I met Stuart returning to the command. Although he had been in the saddle 2 days and nights without sleep, he was as gay as a lark and showed no signs of weariness. He had a right to be proud, for he had performed a feat that to this day has no parallel in the annals of war. I said to him, "This will make you a major general?" He said, "No, I don't think I can be a major general until we have 10,000 cavalry." But in 6 weeks he had that rank. This expedition, in which Stuart had ridden around McClellan in a circle of a radius of 10 miles, created almost as much astonishment in Richmond and even in Europe, as if he had dropped from the clouds, and made him the hero of the army. It had an electric effect on the morale of the Confederate troops and excited their enthusiasm to a high pitch. Always after that the sight of Stuart on the field was like a blast of that dread horn on Fontarabian echoes born. McClellan attempts in his report to belittle it. by saying that in this affair Stuart's cavalry did nothing but gain a little éclatat, but with more truth it might be said that by it he lost a good deal. His staff officer, the Count of Paris, says, in reference to these operations of our cavalry, they had, in point of fact, created a great commotion, shaken the confidence of the North in McClellan, and made the first experiment in those great cavalry expeditions, which subsequently played so novel and so important a part during the war. At midnight, on June 14th, at the very hour when we were marching along his left flank, McClellan telegraphed to Stanton, all quiet in every direction, the stampede of last night has passed away. In his telegram 6 hours before, he had said that we ran away from an infantry force at Tunstall's, that he had sent after us. The fact was that we left that place long before the infantry arrived there, and never heard of it until long after we left. General Reynolds says he never saw us. The stampede that McClellan talks about was not in its our ranks. The Count of Paris again says, as soon as Stuart was known to be at Tunstall's, McClellan had divined his purpose, and dispatched Averill to intercept him. I have made a diligent examination of the archives of the war, but have been unable to find any authority for this statement. The dispatches of the General-in-Chief, the Corps, Division, Brigade, and Regimental commanders, in reference to this raid, have all been published, besides the report of Colonel Klitz, who was ordered to investigate the conduct of those who were charged with the pursuit. They all relate to the operations on McClellan's right, and there is perfect silence as to any attempt to intercept us on his left, or any order to do so. Averill, who was stationed with the cavalry on the left flank, is nowhere mentioned, and there is no report from him. After we crossed the Chickahominy, we were in a St. Cul-de-sac, formed by the junction of that river with the James. Yet we never saw an enemy in that vicinity, although they must or ought to have had 24 hours' notice that we were coming, as the Army headquarters were connected with each corps by both telegraph lines and signal stations. As McClellan was very much criticized for permitting Stuart to escape, if it had been due to the failure of Averill or anyone else to execute his orders, he would have put the blame where it belonged. McClellan's conduct on this occasion has always been unaccountable to me, and the only explanation I have ever seen of it is in the report of General Pleasonton, who soon after that became his chief of cavalry. Pleasonton says McClellan dreaded the rebel cavalry, and supposed that by placing his army on a peninsula with a deep river on each side he was safe from that arm of the enemy, but the humiliation on the Chickahominy of having a few thousand of the enemy, his cavalry ride completely around his army, and the ignominious retreat to Harrison's Landing are additional instances in support of the maxim that a general who disregards the rules of war finds himself overwhelmed by the consequences of such neglect when the crisis of battle follows. 28. This was written by Pleasonton after the war. He does not seem to have felt the humiliation of Stuart's ride around him to Chambersburg, when he, as chief of cavalry of the Army of the Potomac, was charged with the duty of pursuing him. At that time Pleasonton was commanding the 2d U.S. Cavalry. The telegraph line at Tunstall's was repaired soon after Reynolds arrived, on the night of the 13th, and it is impossible to believe that he and Ingalls did not inform the General-in-Chief which way we had gone. Stuart then had no choice of routes, but was confined to the road up James River, or not to return at all. This raid is unique, and distinguished from all others on either side during the war, on account of the narrow limits in which the cavalry was compelled to operate. From the time when he broke through McClellan's line on his right until he had passed around him on his left, Stuart was enclosed by 3 unfordable rivers, over one of which he had to build a bridge to cross. During the whole operation the cavalry never drew a saber except at the first picket post they encountered. But it was something more than a mere raid on McClellan's communications. It was, in fact, a reconnaissance, in force to ascertain the exact location of the different corps of his army, and the prelude to the great battles that began 10 days afterwards, in which Jackson's flank was covered by Stuart's cavalry. 29. General Lee's congratulatory order is as follows. Headquarters Department of Northern VA, Penal Orders, number 74%. June 23, 1862. The commanding general announces with great satisfaction to the Army the brilliant exploit of Brigadier General J.E.B. Stuart, with part of the troops under his command. This gallant officer, with portions of the 1st, 4th, and 9th Virginia Cavalry, part of the Jeff Davis Legion, with whom were the Boykin Rangers, and a section of the Stuart Horse Artillery, on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of June, made a reconnaissance between the Pamunkey and the Chickahominy rivers, and succeeded in passing around the rear of the whole of the Union Army, routing the enemy in a series of skirmishes, taking a number of prisoners, and destroying and capturing stores to a large amount. Having most successfully accomplished its object, the expedition recrossed the Chickahominy almost in the presence of the enemy, with the same coolness and address that marked every step of its progress, and with the loss of but one man, the lamented Latane of the 9th Virginia. Cavalry, who fell bravely leading a successful charge against a superior force of the enemy, in announcing the signal success to the army, the general commanding takes great pleasure in expressing his admiration of the courage and skill so conspicuously exhibited throughout by the general and the officers and men under his command. In addition to the officers honorably mentioned in the report of the expedition, the conduct of the following privates has received the special commendation of their respective commanders: Private Thomas D. Clapp, Company D, 1 Stone Virginia Cavalry, and J.S. Mosby, serving in the same regiment, Privates Ashton, Brent, R. Herring, F. Herring, and F. Coleman, Company E, 9th Virginia Cavalry, by command of R. H. Cheaton, AAG General Lee. In General McClellan's posthumous book there is a private letter of his, dated June 15, 10:04, 5 p.m., in which he says, "I then gave orders to Averill for a surprise party tomorrow to repay Secesh for his raid of day before yesterday. So the surprise party was not ordered until Stuart had got back to camp. The 7 days' battles were fought behind entrenchments and in swamps which afforded no opportunity for the use of cavalry except in guarding the flanks of the infantry and the minor operations of outpost duty. When they were over, the cavalry had a short respite from labor. I never could rest inactive, and so I asked Stuart to let me take a party of men to Northern Virginia. General Pope had then just assumed command of that department. He had a long line of communications to guard, and his scattered army corps offered fine opportunities for partisan war. The wiser policy of concentration had not then been adopted by the Federal generals. Stuart was recruiting his cavalry and was not willing to spare any for detached service, but gave me a letter of introduction to General Jackson, who had been sent up to Gordonsville to observe Pope. He sent him by me a copy of Napoleon's Maxims, which had just been published in Richmond. Stuart wanted Jackson to furnish a detail of cavalry to go with me behind Pope, who had just published the fact to the world that he intended to leave his rear to take care of itself. With a single companion and full of enthusiasm, I started on my mission to Jackson. I concluded to take the cars at Beaver Dam and go on in advance to his headquarters and wait there for my horse to be led on. I was sitting in the depot, and my companion had hardly got out of sight, when a regiment of Union cavalry rode up and put an attachment upon my person. They had ridden all night from Fredericksburg to capture the train which was due in a few minutes. I was chagrined, not only at being a prisoner, but because my cherished hopes were now disappointed. The regiment fronted into a line to wait for the cars, and they placed me in the front rank. I called to an officer and protested against being put where I would be shot by the guard on the train. For some reason the commanding officer gave orders to leave. Perhaps it was because he was as much opposed to being shot as I was. The train soon afterwards arrived, and I do not think there were any soldiers on it. That night I slept on the floor of the guardhouse at Fredericksburg. On the next day the cartel for the exchange of prisoners was agreed on. My imprisonment lasted 10 days, and I confess that I rather enjoyed my visit to Washington. I kept up my habits as a scout and collected a large budget of information. The steamer on which I came back lay 4 days in Hampton Roads and then proceeded up James River. When we first arrived there I noticed a large number of transports, with troops on board, lying near Newport News, and learned that they belonged to Burnside's corps just arrived from North Carolina. Here now was a problem for me to solve. Where were they going? To reinforce Pope or McClellan? I set about to find out. If they went to Pope, it meant the withdrawal of McClellan. The captain of the steamer promised me to find out their destination. A few hours before we left, I observed them all coming down and passing out by Fort Monroe. When the captain returned from on shore, he told me that the transports were going up the Potomac. This settled the question. The Peninsula campaign was over. About 10 o'clock in the morning we reached the point on James River where the commissioners had met. I knew that it would take several hours to complete the exchange, and every minute then was precious. I whispered to the Confederate commissioner, Judge Cold, that I had important news for General Lee, and he let me go immediately. I started off with a haversack full of lemons I had bought at Fort Monroe to walk 12 miles to headquarters on a hot day in August. I trudged on several hours, weary and footsore, until completely exhausted I had fallen down on the roadside. While lying there, a horseman of the Hampton Legion came riding by, and I stopped him and explained my condition and anxiety to see General Lee. He dismounted, put me on his horse, took me to his camp nearby, and getting a horse for himself, went with me to the general's headquarters. I wish that I knew his name, that I might record it with the praise that is due to his generous deed. The first one I met at headquarters, with a good deal of the insolence of office, told me that I could not see the general. I tried to explain that I did not come to ask a favor, but to bring him important information. Another one of the staff standing by told me to wait a moment. He stepped into the adjoining room and soon called me in. I now found myself for the first time in the presence of the great commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was alone and poring over some maps on the table, and no doubt planning a new campaign. Although his manner was gentle and kind, I felt for him an awe and veneration which I have never felt for any other man. He was then the foremost man in all the world, and I almost imagined that I saw one of the Homeric heroes before me. With some embarrassment I told what I had learned about Burnside's troops. He listened attentively, and after I was through called to a staff officer to have a man ready to take a dispatch to General Jackson. At that time communication was kept up between them by a line of relay couriers. They were afraid to trust the telegraph that had been tampered with by raiding parties from Fredericksburg. Jackson received the dispatch that night informing him that Burnside was on his way to Pope, and hastened to strike him at Cedar Mountain before reinforcements could arrive. Pope says, "This battle was fought at a distance of more than 100 miles from Richmond, only 5 days after. General McClellan received his orders to withdraw, and 5 days before he had commenced to do so or had embarked a man. When the Army of the Potomac was being withdrawn from the front of Richmond, General Lee began to transfer his own to the line of the Rapidan. Stuart with his staff came ahead by rail and left Fitz Lee to bring on the cavalry division. I joined him on the evening of August 17th, and that night we rode to a place called Vidyersville in Orange County, where we expected to find the cavalry. It had not, however, come up, and Stuart sent his adjutant to look for it, and the rest of us, 5 in number, unsaddled our horses and lay down to sleep on the porch of a house by the roadside. We were outside our picket lines, and in a mile or so of the enemy on the river, but did not think there was much risk in spending the night there. About sunrise the next morning, a young man named Gibson, who had been a fellow prisoner with me in the old Capitol, woke me up and said that he heard the tramp of cavalry down the road. We saddled quickly and started to see what it was, but first woke Stuart up. As Fitz Lee was due, we supposed it was our own cavalry, but there was a chance that it might be the enemy, and we did not want to be again caught napping. After going about 200 yards, we saw through the morning mist a body of cavalry that had stopped at a house to search it. We halted, but could not tell who they were. Presently 2 officers rode forward and began firing on us. This convinced me that they were no friends of mine, and as neither one of us had a pistol or a saber, I am not ashamed to say that we turned and ran away with the Yankee cavalry close after us. The firing saved Stuart. He had walked out into the yard bareheaded, and when he heard it, mounted his horse and leaped over the fence, and escaped through the backyard with one of his aides just as Gibson and I passed by at full speed. The cavalry stopped the pursuit to pick up Stuart's hat and cloak, and the nice patent leather haversack I had brought from Washington, which we had left on the porch. It was a scouting party General Pope had sent out. They had caught Stuart's adjutant during the night and found on him a letter from General Lee, disclosing the fact that he would cross the river to attack Pope on the 20th. So Pope on the 18th issued orders to withdraw beyond the line of the Rappahannock. He had already received information through a spy that our whole army was assembling in his front and was about retreating anyway. If the cavalry had not stopped at the house, they would have caught us all asleep. Von Borcke, a Prussian officer on Stuart's staff, who published a mass of fables under the title of Memoirs of the Confederate War, gives an account of this affair, in which he represents himself as playing a most heroic part. As Gibson and I were between him and the enemy, and running with all our might, it is hard to discover any heroism in anybody. Von Borcke's horse ran faster than ours, and that was the only distinction he won. The chase was soon over, and we returned immediately to look over the ground. Just as Stuart got in sight of the house, he saw the enemy going off in triumph with his hat and cloak. In 2 days the armies were again confronting each other on the Rappahannock. On the morning of the 22d, the Confederate column began a movement up the river to turn Pope's right. Jackson's corps was just in rear of the cavalry. When we got to Waterloo Bridge, where we crossed, Stuart galloped by and said to me, laughing as he passed, "I am going after my hat." I had no idea then that what he said would come true. He had heard that Pope had his wagon trains parked at Catlett's on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and was going after them. Pope's headquarters were 10 or 12 miles distant, at Rappahannock Station. Stuart had with him about 1,500 cavalry and 2 pieces of artillery. We passed around to Pope's rear unobserved and got to Catlett's just after dark. A picket post on the road was captured without any alarm, and the guards with the trains had no suspicion of our presence until we rode into their camp. General Pope unjustly censures them. Considering the surprise, I think they did remarkably well. It was no fault of theirs that Stuart had got to the rear of their army without being discovered. It was the duty of their cavalry on the front to watch him and tell them he was coming. Fortunately for Pope, the most terrific storm I ever saw came up before we reached Catlett's. But for that, nearly the whole of the transportation of his army would have been destroyed. The night was pitch dark and the rain fell in torrents. Flashes of lightning would often illuminate the scene, and peals of thunder seemed to roll from pole to pole. Stuart halted about half a mile from the station and sent the 1st and 5th Virginia Cavalry to destroy a large park of wagons whose campfires could be seen. I went along with my old regiment. We had to cross a railroad embankment and a ditch, of which the men knew nothing until they tumbled into it. Most of them scrambled out and got into the camp on the other side. It was defended by the bucktails, who, under cover of the wagons in the darkness, poured a hot fire into us. All that we could see was the flashes from their guns. The animals became frightened and increased the noise and confusion of the fight. The shooting and shouting of the men, the braying of the mules, the glare of the lightning and roll of the thunder made it seem like all pandemonium had broken loose. But cavalry, in a fight against invisible infantry, is defenseless. We left the camp with little or no damage to ourselves or the enemy. Other detachments were more successful in burning wagons and making captures. A party was sent to burn the railroad bridge over Cedar Run, but in such a storm they might just as well have tried to burn the creek. It happened that not far from Catlett's we met a Negro in the road who recognized Stuart as an old acquaintance and offered to conduct him to Pope's headquarter wagons. The 9th Virginia Cavalry was sent with the guide after them. A festive party of quartermasters and commissaries was captured there, together with Pope's money chest, dispatch book, and correspondence, and also his wardrobe, including on his hat and ostrich plume. Stuart was now revenged. He had swapped hats with Pope. The material results of the expedition were not what had been expected. The storm of that night, which caused a rise of 6 feet in the river, was the salvation of Pope. The raid had, however, a demoralizing effect on the army whose communication had been so audaciously assailed. Von Borque, as usual, relates prodigies he performed that were never surpassed by Amadis of Gaul. He says that he was detailed by Stuart to capture Pope, and tells how he entered his tent shortly after he had left. Now Pope had never been on the spot. His headquarters were then 15 miles from there, and Stuart knew that a general commanding an army does not sleep with his wagon trains. We returned the next morning by the same route we came, but never saw an enemy. It would be a natural question to ask, what was Pope doing with his cavalry? In the storm and darkness we had failed to cut the telegraph wire, so Pope kept up communication with Washington. At 5:00 p.m. that day, when Stuart's cavalry was in the rear and within a few miles of Catlett's, he told Halleck, "Tin enemy has made no attempt today to cross the river." At 9:00 that night, when we were plundering his headquarter trains, he tells Halleck a heavy force had crossed the river that day, and asked him to send up a brigade to guard the bridge over Cedar Run. But for the providential rain, the bridge would have then been burning, and Halleck would have been saved the trouble of sending infantry to protect it. Pope had no idea where we were. 15 minutes later he tells Halleck that he must either fall back behind Cedar Run or cross the Rappahannock at daybreak the next morning and assail the rear of the Confederate army. Halleck advised the latter movement. Pope said the rise of the river that night that swept away his bridges prevented his crossing. Here Providence stepped in again and saved him. If the stars in their courses fought against Sisera, So did the floods against Robert E. Lee in this campaign. At that time, Jackson and Longstreet were in front of Pope, and Stuart was behind him. A week after this he was defeated, when we were no stronger and he had received at least 25,000 reinforcements from McClellan, but General Pope had left out an important factor in his calculation, and that was Stonewall Jackson. He had already thrown one of his brigades over the river at Sulphur Springs, but the storm arrested the passage of the others. If General Pope had attempted such a movement, as he indicated to Halleck, General Lee would not have interfered with it, but let him go on. Jackson and Stuart would then have swept down the north bank of the river in his rear, and General Pope would have found himself in the condition of a fly in an exhausted receiver. This would have saved Jackson the long flank march he afterwards made to Manassas without involving his separation from Longstreet. Speaking of the raid on Catlett's, General Pope says, "At the time this cavalry force attacked Catlett's, and it certainly was not more than 300 strong. Our whole army trains were parked at that place, and were guarded by not less than 1,500 infantry and 5 companies of cavalry." The success of this small party of the enemy, although very trifling and attended with but very little damage, was most disgraceful to the force that had been left in charge of the trains. It was certainly not the fault of the troops guarding the trains that they had no notice that we were coming, and I think he has greatly exaggerated their number. On the 25th, Jackson, having gone higher up the river, crossed the Rappahannock 4 miles above Waterloo Bridge, which was held by Sigel's Corps and Buford's cavalry. The Black Horse Company 30 acted as his escort, and the 2nd Virginia Cavalry led the advance. The signal stations near the rivers reported this movement immediately to General Pope. An officer in the army under Pope, who had been a classmate of Jackson's at West Point, thus speaks of the great hero and his wonderful march. "In that devotion which men yield to monarchs of the battlefield, in that glow of pride which men share with the great chieftain whose powers have created chances and directed results, the soldier, subjects under Napoleon Bonaparte were closely allied in enthusiasm, in worship, and in admiration with the soldier citizens under Stonewall Jackson. 30, commanded by Captain D. Payne, the sun sank down, the stars appeared, the night sped on till nearly 12, when Jackson's advance had approached within 1 mile of Salem, where, as his weary column sank down to rest, McDowell received the message that Pope believed the enemy was marching for the Shenandoah Valley by way of Front Royal and Luray. On the mathematical principle that parallel lines meet in infinity, Jackson might have reached the valley by the route he had traveled. His camp that night was in Pope's rear, and in 12 miles of McDowell, who was occupying Warrenton, but General Pope was bewildered, and appeared to have no suspicion of where he was going. At daylight no revel sounded in the Confederate camps, but Jackson moved silently on and turned to the east. After his column had passed out of sight of the signal stations, General Pope seemed to lose entirely the touch of it, but the lost Pleiad kept on its way. A competent general would have struck Jackson's flank with a cavalry reconnaissance on his first day's march. I do not know whether the failure to do so was the fault of the chief of cavalry or the commander-in-chief. On the 26th, before daylight, Stuart's cavalry corps crossed the Rappahannock and followed the route Jackson had taken the day before until it got to Salem and then turned to the right. About 4:00 p.m., we overtook General Jackson at Gainesville, having marched all day around the flank and rear of the Federal Army without seeing an enemy. We were now within about 7 miles of Manassas Junction. On the same day, Longstreet followed on Jackson's track. While all this was going on in his rear, General Pope's attention had been attracted by some Confederate batteries that kept up a fire in his front. His army remained motionless. Its very tranquility at last became oppressive. Some feared that it was the awful stillness that precedes the storm, that he was imitating Napoleon at Austerlitz, and allowing one wing of our army to be extended in order to pierce its center and destroy it. About 6:00 on the afternoon of the 26th, the advance of Jackson's column under Colonel Munford struck the Orange and Alexandria Railroad at Bristow Station, 9 miles from Pope's headquarters, which were at Warrenton Junction. The small guard was surprised and captured. They had no more expectation of seeing Stonewall Jackson than Hamlet's ghost. Just then a train came up and ran the gauntlet under fire that carried the astounding news to Manassas, 5 miles off. From there it was telegraphed to Washington. 2 more trains came along in a few minutes that had just left headquarters and were caught. Stuart was then sent on with a force of infantry and cavalry to capture Manassas, which, with all its immense stores, fell into his hands. 20,000 Confederate troops were now behind General Pope, and Longstreet was marching around his flank, but his army still faced the other way. As General Jackson says, "My command was now in the rear of General Pope's army, separating it from the federal capital and base of supplies. This march of Jackson's I regard as one of the most wonderful things ever achieved in war." General Pope says that it was plainly seen and promptly reported to General Halleck, but that so confidently did he rely on troops promised from Washington being in position to oppose Jackson that it gave him no uneasiness. That it gave General Pope no uneasiness, I think, is due to the fact that he knew nothing about it. It certainly would have given Napoleon or Wellington a good deal of uneasiness to have had Stonewall Jackson with 20,000 men in his rear and in 9 miles of his headquarters. Now, it seems to me that his knowledge of what Jackson was doing cannot be reconciled with fidelity to his government, and his contemporaneous dispatches and conduct can only be explained on the theory of his ignorance of the movement, or his in cooperation with Jackson. The night before he had told McDowell that he believed the Confederate troops had gone to the Shenandoah Valley. Jackson, I know, did marvelous things, but General Pope could hardly have thought he could march an army east and west at the same time. If he knew that Jackson was going to Manassas, he could not have believed that he had gone to the valley. Admitting that he thought Franklin's corps was at Manassas to meet him, he would be a curious commander-in-chief not to inquire if it was, or not to give his subordinate warning of the enemy's approach, in order that he might get ready to fight, or burn his stores and run away. If he had even called the telegraph operators at Bristow and Manassas, they could have told him that there were just enough troops there to get caught, and that they knew nothing of Jackson's coming. He tells McDowell, after Jackson got to Bristow, that the enemy's cavalry have interrupted communication with Manassas, and orders a single regiment to go down on the cars to repair the damage. Did he think one regiment could drive Stonewall Jackson away? The next morning Halleck sends up a brigade to Manassas. That was almost annihilated, its commander killed, and the train captured on which they came. If Halleck had known he was sending them into the jaws of death, he would have incurred a criminal responsibility. All of General Pope's orders and dispatches at the time have been published. There is not a hint in any of them that he knew of Jackson's movement around him. The first time he suspected it was when the telegraph wire was cut, and he had to stop talking with Halleck. 3 hours after that, McDowell telegraphs to Pope that night intelligent. Negro had just come in and reported that Jackson had passed through Thoroughfare Gap that day. Pope's answer shows that this news was a revelation and a surprise to him. At that time, Jackson's men, after a march of over 50 miles in 2 days, were eating his rations in sight of the blazing bridges and railroad trains at Manassas. The next day, a cavalry reconnaissance under Buford was ordered to Salem to ascertain the truth of the Negro's statement. If it had been sent 2 days earlier, it might have done some good, but Pope did not wait to hear from Buford, but changed front and hastened towards Manassas to recover his communications. Buford returned with his broken-down cavalry to Warrenton that night, but Pope's whole army had gone during that day. Jackson's wearied soldiers were resting and refreshing themselves from their abundant spoils. At night, Jackson marched away towards Thoroughfare to unite with Longstreet. The supplies that he could not transport were burned. Pope's army, with the railroad broken, was now in a starving condition. To lead Pope astray, Hill's division was sent a roundabout way by Centerville and rejoined Jackson the next day at Sudley. 31. See his dispatch to Halleck. The reason that Jackson left Manassas was that Stuart had captured a dispatch showing that Pope was concentrating his army on that point. General Jackson says, "General Stuart kept me advised of the movements of the enemy." In a dispatch to Fitzjohn Porter on the evening of the 27th, Pope ordered him to be at Bristow at daylight the next morning to bag Jackson, who was then 5 miles off. General Pope says that Jackson made a mistake in leaving Manassas before he got there. If Jackson went there to be caught, it was if Pope had reached the place at daylight, he would have found nothing but a rear guard of Stuart's cavalry. He has censured Porter for not getting there in time to bag Jackson. Pope himself arrived about noon. It happened that the evening before I rode off to a farmer's house to get some supper, and slept under a tree in the yard. The next morning I returned to the junction thinking our army was still there. I found the place deserted and as silent as the cities of the plain. So, if General Pope and Fitzjohn Porter had come at that time, they might have caught me, that is, if their horses were faster than mine. Pope was deceived by Jackson's stratagem and marched off to Centerville to find him. Every step he took in that direction carried him farther from Jackson. He seemed to be groping in the dark. Instead of marching his infantry off in the morning on a fool's errand to Manassas in search of Jackson, he ought first to have felt the enemy with his cavalry, and then maneuvered his army so as to intercept his junction with Longstreet. Pope did exactly the reverse. On the evening of the 28th, Longstreet drove Ricketts' division from Thoroughfare, and the head of his column bivouacked in about 6 miles of Jackson. During the fight I rode with Stuart towards the Gap. As Ricketts was then between him and Longstreet, Stuart sent a dispatch by a trusty messenger, urging him to press on to the support of Jackson. I do not think any other commander ever performed such a feat, or extricated himself from such perils as environed Jackson on this expedition. His success was largely due to Stuart's cavalry, who were the eyes of the army, that brought him quick intelligence of the enemy, and, as the Count of Paris says, screened all Jackson's movements, as with an impenetrable veil. On the morning of the 29th, in a despatch to Porter and McDowell, General Pope says, "The indications are that the whole force of the enemy is moving in this direction at a pace that will bring them here by tomorrow night or next morning." His cavalry could not then have informed him of the result of the combat between Longstreet and Ricketts on the afternoon before, for it was impossible for him to believe that the man who was called the war horse of the Southern Army would take 2 days to march 6 miles with the thunders of battle rolling in his ears. General Pope does not seem to have recovered his mental equilibrium when he wrote his report, for he says, in one place, every indication during the night of the 29th and up to 10 o'clock on the morning of the 30th pointed to the retreat of the enemy from our front. And further on he says, during the whole night of the 29th and the morning of the 30th, the advance of the main army under Lee was arriving on the field to reinforce Jackson. That is, the arrival of 30,000 fresh Confederate troops on the field was a sign to General Pope that they were running away. No one can study this campaign without being struck by the marked difference between the commanders of the two armies in the employment of their cavalry. A distinguished general who served under Pope says that judicious use of cavalry by which Jackson covered his front, concealed his movements, discovered his enemies, and succeeded in his raids, had not at that period been generally appreciated by Federal commanders, and was almost entirely neglected by Pope. I cannot close this account of the part borne by Stuart's cavalry in this campaign without some reference to the use that has been made of his report of it by the partisans of General Pope and the criticism it has borne from the friends of General Porter. It is remarkable that both parties should agree in the construction put upon it, and that so clearly a wrong one. One side refers to it to prove the assertion of General Pope, I believe, in fact I am positive, that at 5 o'clock on the afternoon of the 29th General Porter had in his front no considerable body of the enemy. I believed then, as I am very sure now, that it was easily practicable for him to have turned the right flank of Jackson and to have fallen on his rear, and if he had done so, we should have gained a decisive victory over the army under Jackson before he could have been joined by any of the forces of Longstreet, etc. He further says that about sunset of the 29th the advance of Longstreet began to arrive on the field. The essence of the controversy is the time of Longstreet's arrival. Could Porter have reached Gainesville, the objective point on which he and Longstreet marched that day, in time to have executed the order of 4:30 p.m. of the 29th to turn the Confederate flank? While the order does not specify Jackson's, but says the enemy's flank, it clearly referred to Jackson, for General Pope asserted that Longstreet was not then on the field and could not arrive before the next day, as Porter and Longstreet had camped the night before about the same distance from that place, and as Porter 32, owing to contradictory orders, had marched twice the distance that Longstreet did, the presumption is that the latter arrived there first. 32, Porter's corps, camped at Bristow the night of the 28th. About 6 o'clock on the morning of the 29th he was ordered by Pope to Centerville. When he got near Bull Run he was ordered to countermarch to Gainesville. To my mind, Stuart is a conclusive witness for Porter. Yet one critic, General Cox, argues that there was no obstruction but Stuart's cavalry between Porter and Jackson, and an author of a defense of Porter, General George H. Gordon, calls his report a romance. Stuart says that General Lee arrived at Gainesville on the morning of the 29th with Longstreet's corps, that he passed his cavalry through Longstreet's column and placed it on his flank, that during the day his vedettes reported the approach of Porter's corps, and that he sent notice of it to General Lee, who ordered infantry and artillery to his support. He adds that in the meantime he kept his cavalry dragging brush to raise a dust, and that the ruse had the desired effect of deceiving Porter. As Stuart was recovering Longstreet's flank, he would be close to it. Now the object he had in dragging the brush was to deceive Porter as to the force with which he was in immediate contact. His saying that Porter was deceived by it was the mere expression of his opinion, not the statement of a fact. Stuart's object was to gain time enough for Longstreet, not Jackson, to readjust his line to meet a threatened attack on his flank. That was all. If Porter saw a heavy cloud of dust rising in the road before him, he could not tell, without halting his column and reconnoitering, what created it. But the delay involved in doing this was all that Stuart wanted. Longstreet had been in the same dilemma at Salem 2 days before. When he reached there, he met Buford's cavalry. If he had known that nothing else was in front of him, he would have brushed them away with a few skirmishers without losing a minute on his march. But he halted his column, he says, and was detained an hour before he could find out what it was. Pope was deceived by a few shells the Confederates threw at him across the Rappahannock into the belief that our army was in his front, when in fact it was in his rear. The divine genius has never yet appeared in war that could always at a glance detect every stratagem and see through every mask. He who wars, says Napier, walks in a mist through which the keenest eye cannot always discern the right path. The Military Society of Massachusetts has published a volume of papers on the Fitz-John Porter case, which contains a letter from General B.H. Robertson to General Porter in which he says there was no cavalry in that direction, Manassas Junction and Tiamat Mine, which was held there the remainder of the day, and again he says, I have no knowledge of bushes having been dragged by cavalry to create the impression of large forces coming, or for any purpose. Had these directions been given, the order would naturally have been transmitted through me. I heard no order on that subject. General Porter says there was no dragging of brush, nor such a project thought of, although General Stuart so states in his report. General Pope harps on it. The conclusion suggested is that the statement contained in Stuart's report is false, because Robertson had never heard of it. There are more things in heaven and earth than were ever dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. Now, General Robertson is mistaken in saying that we had no cavalry in the direction from which Porter approached, but his percent Stuart was there in person with a part of Fitz-Lee's brigade. General Rosser, who was then a colonel in Lee's brigade, says, when Stuart joined me, he notified me that the enemy was moving on our right flank and ordered me to move my command up and down the dusty road and to drag brush and thus create a heavy dust, as though troops were in motion. I kept this up at least 4 or 5 hours. Robertson was relieved by Stuart of his command immediately after the battle and sent back to a camp of instruction. General Porter was not inside the Confederate lines that day. It is hard to understand how he could know that the brush was not dragged to raise a dust to deceive him, or that nothing of the sort was thought of. I am glad that he has been relieved of an unjust sentence, but I am not willing to be silent now when young Harry Percy's spur is cold, and see his reputation sacrificed to save General Porter's